This is Spirit Gym. Today's guest is Dr. Alexis Cowan, PhD. Alexis completed her PhD research in the Rabinowitz lab at Princeton, one of the top metabolism research labs in the world. She now works with clients one-on-one, helping them to understand the best approaches to deal with the real-world health challenges faced by modern humans today. Thank you for listening to this podcast, which would not be possible without you, our subscribers, and also our premier sponsors, Organifi, Bioptimizers, Paleo Valley, and Wild Pastures. The sponsors' special offers and discounts are mentioned throughout this episode, or you can visit the show notes page at paulchek.com/podcast. In this episode, Alexis and Paul explore light biology, circadian biology, and mitochondrial biology.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Spirit Gym with Paul Chek. Our guest today is Alexis Cowan. We're gonna have a deep discussion. The title of our podcast today is Light, a Deeper Look. Alexis is very, very knowledgeable on these topics. She's well known. She was referred to me by my good buddy, soul brother, Kyle Kingsbury, and all of his recommendations and referrals have been fantastic. So I trusted him, and Alexis gave me a beautiful outline today. And as I looked at it, I was very, very impressed. So we're going to take you on a deep journey into light and have a deeper look. I'm sure you're going to learn a hell of a lot from Alexis. I know I'm going to learn a lot from her just by looking at the outline. So Alexis, it's great to have you. And as I was just sharing with you a minute ago, in the ancient German spiritual teachings, the sun was considered a female. So it's great to have a woman sun here with us. So thank you for all the hard work you've done to develop your expertise and help so many people. And I'm excited that you're here in Spirit Gym with me to help people learn a lot more that can really help them. So welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. As I was sharing a moment ago, you were really very influential for me. About 10 years ago, I came across your work, and that's what really catalyzed my journey into holistic health. I mean, just as a very brief aside, I had a lot of health issues growing up and was very disenfranchised with the standard medical model from literally age 2 up through, today. So basically, I was always looking for other solutions. I lost 100 pounds in high school, which was
Wow.
like the beginning of my health journey, but it also created just as many problems as it solved. So like I had an eating disorder after that and pretty bad irritable bowel syndrome, ulcerative colitis, and that was
Wow.
really my catalyst to delving into the world of holistic health and finding your work and finding all the areas in my life that I could leverage to heal myself and support my body, and was able to do so successfully. And that was just, such an incredible invitation by life to allow me to not only support my own body, but then be able to support others and deepen my knowledge to understand, why certain things work and just feed my curiosity as well. So I have to thank you for not only having me, but for being so influential and just providing such great information to people for, I think you said, over 40 years at this point. So it's pretty
Yeah.
remarkable.
Yeah. Well, you're looking beautiful now. So good job.
Thank you.
A whole great spirit.
Yes.
Well, to begin with, I love my guests to get a sense of who you are, a deeper connection, so that as we go deeper into the podcast, they kind of have a feeling they understand who you are. So maybe you could share your developmental background, your education, where that's relevant. And I'd like you to share an overview of your living philosophy so we can see how Alexis sees the world and engages the world.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe to start with the last piece, I feel like my living philosophy has always been to follow my curiosity. I think I've always been a very curious person from a very young age, just wanting to understand like how things work and why things are the way they are. And so like I mentioned, I had a lot of health issues as a kid that I didn't, wasn't really able to navigate myself, was kind of at the mercy of the system, though luckily we didn't have health insurance. So for example, in first grade, they really wanted to take my tonsils out because I
Oh,
kept
yeah.
getting recurring strep throat. We didn't have insurance, so like we couldn't really afford to do it. So thankfully, I still have my tonsils. We know now they're a really important part of the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. It's not like this
Mm-hmm.
dispendable organ, or how it's treated. So
Yeah.
I had a lot of run-ins with, situations like that with doctors and dentists and oral surgeons that were really just abusive in a lot of ways and gaslighting, and nobody ever talked about, the influence of the environment on one's health. And Meanwhile, reflecting back at that time, I know I had a lot of there was a lot of black mold in the home.
Yep.
We had carpet in the bathroom, like, and I remember damp water smells, like,
Oh,
in the
bad. Yeah.
home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. But on the flip side, we did live on a couple acres in the middle of the woods, and I had a lot of nature around me and a lot of outdoor time, barefoot, playing around, like, not the outdoor environment was great. It was really the inside that was a problem. And so in after high school, like I mentioned, I lost 100 pounds and I had my first psychedelic experience shortly after graduating. And at the time, I was in culinary school and I was going to go that trajectory. But after this experience, it was with LSD. It really just like blew my mind and my heart wide open. And I just had this sense that I needed to change trajectory. So when I had that experience, I was visiting my friend at her college campus, Moravian College in the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania, and I ended up transferring there and starting with general education courses, and among them was chemistry. And I really felt like I had a knack for chemistry. And so I ended up taking more chemistry courses, then found out that biochemistry could be a degree. And I was like, that's cool because then I can relate it more to my body and understand, like, health more. And so I ended up taking a biochemistry degree with a math minor. And as a side note, I took a math minor because I always struggled with math. And whenever I struggle with something, I want to like be good at it because it's like a challenge basically.
Mm.
So I took a math minor, graduated in 2015 with that. I didn't have any idea what I wanted to do with that degree per se, and I never really thought about going into a career related to the health sciences despite my own journey. I've always just kind of followed whatever felt right in the moment and whatever opportunities present themselves. I'll take it if it feels like it's the right move. And so I ended up taking a gap year before going to grad school. The idea of grad school was really piqued by one of my professors that kind of took me under his wing. I did some research with him. He put me in this, like, got me into this summer program at Duke one summer before graduating from Moravian. And I basically had like a mock grad school experience. And then I learned, basically if you go to grad school and get your PhD, you get paid to do research and you can, push off your student loans. And it's like, okay, this sounds like a great scenario. Like, why not? And so I ended up taking a gap year, try to figure out where I wanted to go. Ended up applying to Princeton. It was kind of close, so I could commute there. And at the time, I had gotten together with my partner, who had a very young child at the time. So I was like, we don't want to, up upheave our lives and move him to different schools and things like that. So I ended up going to Princeton, not because like it's Princeton, but because it was close and I got a good vibe when I was there. So I joined there. But that was like a whole can of worms. I ended up finding a good lab that was like a good fit for me. But I had some struggles getting there, and there's just a whole host of issues with academia that we don't have to get into now. But like a lot of it was glaring while I was there. There's just so much. But anyways, so I joined the Rabinowitz lab, which is one of the top metabolism research labs in the world at Princeton. And there I was studying the effects of different nutrient inputs on the body. So I was studying basically the difference between fasting and feeding on metabolism at the whole body level and also at the organ specific level. Also, high fat ketogenic diet versus versus a high carbohydrate diet and how that affected metabolism. And so I was very focused on food and exercise and those impacts on metabolic function of different organs and tissues. But light wasn't on my radar, but I do like to tell the story at this time. I did have a little bit of an awakening relative to circadian biology and light biology because I was doing some circadian studies with mice and I had to go into the mouse room in the middle of the night to take some like blood samples from them. And when I went into the mouse room at like, let's say 2 a.m., when I went in there, I could only turn on red lights because we knew full well that if we put on bright white lights in the middle of the night, it would disrupt their circadian rhythms. So I would collect my samples under red light and then go back to the lab under harshest fluorescent lights you could ever imagine to prepare the samples. And there was this little voice in me at the time that was like, there's some cognitive dissonance here. Like, why am I so scrupulous about the circadian rhythm of the rodents, but not my own circadian rhythm? Like, I'm compromising my own health in order to understand health. Like,
That's not uncommon, unfortunately.
yeah, exactly. And that's all of academia basically is just it's like talking heads, disembodied
Mhm.
information that's not relevant to the real world in so many ways. And so I knew, even though I had, great experiences in academia to a certain extent, I also knew that I didn't want to go there and like be a professor and have my own lab in that standard model because I saw how professors in those positions were. They were basically spending 90% of their time writing grants for funding from the three-letter agencies, and they didn't have any time to mentor students, to come up with, interesting project ideas, to do really good science. And I further learned, after the fact, after graduating, about just the issues with the journal model and scientific funding and how it hasn't always been like this and how it really changed around 1950s, actually with Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, who started the journal industry, which is kind of interesting. But before that, it was mostly blue sky research, meaning that basically if the government wanted to fund you as a researcher, they would just say, basically, we believe in you and your mind, take this money and do something interesting with it that you think is valuable.
Right.
Versus now, everything is about projects. It's like, you need to do a project that is focused on treating this specific type of cancer and finding a mechanism by which it can be drugged. And it's like very project oriented, and there's no creativity in science anymore. And so I really saw firsthand that like what we're doing isn't really science. It's like technician work for the most
Yeah.
part. People are going in for their PhDs. They're basically being handed projects and told what to do, and sometimes told what the outcomes should be.
Yep.
And then they go ahead and find it and you get your degree, but you're not actually being trained as a scientist. And so, anyways, I ended up graduating in 2020. Wait, what did I graduate? 2021, December. 2022, I started my business working with clients one on one, athletes, high performers, and also people who are just disenfranchised with the standard medical approach. And at the time, I was very focused on the microbiome and thinking that was like the number one thing, that was the most important thing nobody was talking about. And it's very important. And, working on rehabbing the microbiome and optimizing it can be very supportive for people. And then I ended up going back for a postdoc at UPenn in 2023. And during that time is when I fell down the rabbit hole on light and circadian biology after listening to Rick Rubin's podcast with Jack Cruz and Andrew Huberman. And my whole brain just basically exploded. And I was like, but at the same time, everything he was saying made perfect sense. And I could really see how I could just very easily overlay it onto all the information I had gathered over my 10 years in academia. It was like there were just these little light bulbs going off, so to speak, that just made perfect sense. And it also made sense why in a society where we're really focused on diet and exercise that we're still sicker than ever. And like part of that is because people aren't implementing the practices that they should be.
Mm-hmm.
But part of that is related to motivation and the fact that motivation and drive are really biochemical. And that if we're not curating an environment that actually supports our biochemistry and our neurochemistry, we're setting ourselves up for failure. And I learned, beginning to learn about all the impacts that light has on our neuroendocrinology and our hormones and all of these different features of our lifestyles that people just completely take for granted. And for the first time in our species existence, we're now living, 90%, 95% indoor lifestyles under artificial light, behind glass that filters natural light and removes UV and infrared, which we'll talk about later as these very important frequencies. And we've curated this light environment that's completely alien. It's as if we are basically creating our own asteroid, is what Dr. Cruz likes to say, because when the dinosaurs went extinct, it was because asteroid comes, all this debris goes up into the atmosphere, and it changes the light spectrum that's available to those organisms now. And certain organisms are able to survive it and certain aren't. We're now doing it to ourselves without really being conscious of it, living under this artificial light that's high in flicker, that's high in blue light, that's devoid of the frequencies that our biology actually needs to work successfully. So that's like my brief introduction. That's not so brief, but I'm sure we're gonna dive into the details of why
I love it. I love it. I'm very grateful. It's a great journey you've been on, and I'm impressed that you actually listen to your inner guidance and don't just go where, the Joneses are going, so to speak. One of the things that I wanted to jump in and mention about the university system is they get people they're like you, that you do all the research for them, then they patent what you find, make millions and billions, and you get jack shit.
Yes, exactly.
And one of the things that came to my mind while you were just describing, the environment and the way we're living is something that's really a big problem in my eyes, and that's all the chemtrails. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what that's doing, not only to people, but to every living organism on the planet, because I've spent a lot of time researching this, and the more I go into it, the more disgusted and sick I get. And I just heard there was just a Instagram post by a lady who did a lot of research, and she went right down to the airport where the pilots are bombing her neighborhood with this stuff, and she laid it on them, and they didn't even give a shit. They just pawned it all off. Oh, we just work for them. We just work for them. She goes, like, where do you live? You're underneath. You're spraying this on yourself, and it was shocking. It's exactly why I got out of the military. Everybody's brainwashed, and I'm just carrying out orders. Yeah, you idiot. You're carrying out orders. They're going to get you killed, and you're not asking any questions. And so I'm just curious, with all your knowledge, I'm sure you know enough about chemtrails to have some concerns. So what do you think this is actually doing?
Big time. I mean, it's something I post constantly about on Instagram because I'm here in New Jersey, Central Jersey, in the Princeton area still. And they're pretty relentless here. It's a very blue state. I feel like the blue states typically get the brunt of it. And uh, at a very basic level, so like I've never seen with my own eyes. I haven't been able to go into a plane and see, this is the button they push to put the chemtrails. But what I can
Yeah.
say is I followed the paper trails. There's actually papers on PubMed, and I have a highlight reel on my Instagram that people can visit. It's called Weather Modification. It's a highlight reel that's highlighting evidence that published research from going back into the 1940s of weather modification projects, cloud seeding. Actually, in 1948, there was a project called Storm Fury where the US military basically wanted to see if they could modulate a hurricane's trajectory, and they used cloud seeding to do so with silver nanoparticles. You can basically spray silver, I think silver chloride or
Yeah.
something like
Mhm.
this into the atmosphere, and it can seed new clouds. And they did that, and instead of steering the hurricane away from the coast, it was like in the Gulf, it actually steered it towards the coast, and it ended up completely ravaging a town, I believe in Georgia at the time. And there was a whole bunch of bad PR basically after that because, the people kind of knew what was going on. And so I think then that at that point, the cloud seeding programs and the weather modification programs went kind of underground, but they never stopped. So these have been going on for decades. There is research and published in PubMed as well showing that what's called SAI, solar uh, wait, is it SAI? Stratospheric aerosol injection, yeah, that is used to basically reflect sunlight back out into space to prevent global warming, quote unquote.
Which is, unfortunately, in my opinion, just a pile of bullshit. I've studied that
Absolutely.
quite a bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's total horse shit. The whole carbon dioxide part of the story is also ridiculous. Like we don't actually have high carbon dioxide levels on the lower side, and you don't want low carbon dioxide because then plant life can't thrive and you're crushing the ecosystem essentially.
Yes.
So we have a paper trail showing that they're probably already using SAI, the stratospheric aerosol injection, to prevent it's basically solar radiation management is what they call it, SRM. And so I can't say for certain because I never seen with my eyeballs that this is going on. But what I can say is that every morning, if you go out in the morning around sunrise, you see the whole horizon is streaked with lines.
Yes.
These are not normal clouds. Like you have to gaslight yourself so hard to think that these clouds are normal. Like go outside midday sun. There's this checkerboards over the skies, lines everywhere. I see them often spraying it. I'll even go on my flight radar on my app, and those planes that are spraying, I can't see them on the app. So whether they're military or unidentified, whatever they are, something is coming out of them, and those somethings, those trails are staying in the sky for hours. They're just
Mm-hmm.
spreading out, and they're blocking sunlight. So whether they're contrails, like many people will gaslight others and say, they're just contrails. Even if they were just contrails, they are still blocking sunlight from reaching the earth by, reflecting it back out. And you can feel when these trails are in the sky, the sun feels less warm. There's just less intensity reaching the earth. And we know sunlight, we're going to get into it, but it's so important for the food web. Photosynthesis requires sunlight. There's also something called human photosynthesis. Like our bodies can leverage sunlight directly to create free energy as well as plants. And so there's just so much wrong with any oligarch or, technocrat thinking that they can just block out the sun on a whim where it's actually affecting everybody and without informed consent, which they would never get. This is completely just the most criminal activity that I could ever fathom.
I've heard there's a few states now that have actually outlawed it, which
Yeah.
I'm very excited about.
So Tennessee is one of them, but the
Yeah.
problem is I have friends in Tennessee and they still have trails. Apparently, the ban only affects state planes in their state, but federal planes can still come in and spray,
Oh,
apparently.
Jesus, yeah. Well,
Yes,
at least people are becoming aware of it, and it's getting to
yes,
courts. Kinda
yes,
like the whole thing with COVID went eventually, courtrooms just burst open with all this shit. A
yes.
couple of things I wondered if you knew about. I saw a very interesting post from somebody who was talking about a famous video editor that got hired by Disney and got paid $8 billion to go back into every one of their movies for as far back and to create skies with chemtrails in them to program people to think that this is just how the clouds always form so they
Oh my
wouldn't
god.
investigate chemtrails, which is
That's rich.
that's the
Wow.
kind of horse shit we're dealing with from these. I don't know if for the listeners, have you ever read the book or listened to Controligarchs by Seamus Bruner?
No.
It's an expose of Bill Gates, Soros, and all the top guys behind all this shit. It's mind blowing, and it shows that they're all psychopaths, every one of them. And to kind of add another dimension, I watched a real interesting video I just happened to come across, and it was a guy who's been he has some. I think his job is something to do with solar panels, and he lives in the mountains, I believe, here in California. And he's way out where he can only generate his own power through solar. And he's been monitoring how much energy his solar panels produce. And he showed that since they've been spraying chemtrails, he's getting less and less energy from his solar panels, and he can
Right.
objectively measure it. And he's showing that they're basically stopping us from producing energy using solar systems. So yeah, I just was curious because, being a topic today on light, this is a very, very serious problem in the toxicity. I saw another interview with a doctor who works with pilots and has had to treat many of these pilots for the diseases they're getting from spraying all this stuff. And he says almost every one of them argue with him and don't believe that that's where it's coming from because they've been brainwashed into believing it's not harmful. And I'm like, oh my God, how can you be a pilot and be that stupid?
It's crazy. Though, I mean, as a pilot, you're getting irradiated all day, every day when you're up there, so maybe
Yep.
that's contributing to the issue, but, I mean, even with silver iodide, I think it is, or chloride when they're using that for, cloud seeding, we know that silver is very potent antimicrobial, so eventually
Yes.
that's coming down, getting into the soils, disrupting the soil microbiome, disrupting nutrient quality of food, disrupting our gut microbiome, like, when you're affecting the soil microbes, you're directly affecting your own soil inside of your body. We're part of nature, right? So we can't
Yeah.
do something to nature without doing something to ourselves, and yet there's this disconnect, this like just inability to see that connection because basically our frontal lobes got in the way and makes us think that we're, somehow some fancy creature that has nothing to do with nature and we're above it all and we can have dominion over the land and it's like
Hmm.
not exactly. It doesn't work
Yeah.
out very well.
No. Yeah. Once you start messing with the soil microorganisms, you're messing with the energy grid of the entire planet, without which trees and plants cannot grow and will not grow.
Yes.
And I talk about this in many, many lectures. I've studied the soil system and courses in soil science quite extensively throughout my career. And, most people are pretty clueless to what's really going on in the soil. But when you start blocking light from the soil, not to mention the fact I've seen multiple documentaries now showing they're spraying glyphosate all over the world in the national forests and everywhere. I'm like, are you out of your fucking mind? And a lot of this boils down to these large corporations doing deals with the government, getting inside and buying the government off just so they can sell this shit and dump it everywhere, which is just
Yes.
fucking unbelievable. And fortunately, Donald Trump, as much as I see him as a double-edged sword, has been doing some good cleanup. And if RFK gets in there, I think we've got a chance of actually moving in the right direction. I'm
I
always
agree.
I'm always sensitive to how much of the good stuff is to hide what else is going on, but compared to Kamala Harris and Biden, it's a godsend.
I agree, and I think Bobby that's one thing that he actually mentioned during his campaign was, geoengineering and
Yeah.
stopping that, and that's one thing that it's like, okay, as consumers, we can choose what foods we buy and if we move our bodies and, these types of things. But if our skies are literally being sprayed and the sun is being blocked, we can't do anything about that as individuals. We actually need top-down reform in order to prevent that. And so that's why it's something I think is like the utmost importance. And even if he doesn't accomplish anything else, if he can accomplish something in that department, it's going to be a huge win.
Have you ever studied the book Pottinger's Cats?
Yes, yes,
Okay. Well, you saw what happened in the fourth generation. The cats just became extinct.
yes.
They died out. I mean, I could list all the things, but I won't do it for time's sake. But then it took him 4 generations of feeding them raw milk and meat, organic food to regenerate them back to where they were at. Well, since the, industrial food revolution began, we're many more than 4 generations in. And if you look at what's happening, for example, the cats lost their sexual preference. They couldn't differentiate. They would
Yep.
throw a cat in the air and it would land on its head. It had no balance skills anymore. They had high rates of miscarriage and birth defects. So when you look at what's going on publicly, you're actually seeing Pottinger's cats live. And so when you start adding all this vaccines and chemtrails and poisoning the food, poisoning the water, I mean, my God.
Totally. And I feel like the crazy part of it is the people who are pushing this are also in it. Like they're
I
also being
know.
harmed.
Where the fuck do you live? Where do your kids live? I mean, you're Lao Tzu speaks of sharpening a knife to the point that it becomes dull. And I think a lot of these guys are so sharp, they're dull to what really matters the most. I mean, who gives a fuck how much money you have if you're dying,
Literally exactly that. And so I think it's just a very short game. I mean, if we look at our ancestors, most of them were playing long games. Like they were thinking multiple generations down the line. And it seems
Typically
like
7.
yeah, and now it's just we're just getting by day to day, basically. What deal can I make today to make some money despite what may happen a year from now, 10 years from now? It's like we're very, very myopic. And actually, we'll talk about it, but I think this is very highly related to the light environment, which directly shapes our sympathetic to parasympathetic activation, our
Mm-hmm.
neurohormones, our dopamine systems, which allow us to actually, basically be good critical thinkers. And so a lot of this comes down to very fundamental aspects of the inputs that shape how our biology functions, and light is one of the main ones.
Yes. And I think, too, this information needs to get out to parents because our
Yes,
children are the future. And never have the children of this planet been in such terrible, terrible shape.
yes,
And we work very hard to keep our kids in top shape with the best food and a beautiful environment and Waldorf education. And they're super, super sharp kids, like little geniuses. It's amazing how wildly capable and intelligent they are. And I believe from a spiritual perspective, there's a lot of souls coming into the planet now to help clean the mess up, who are
yeah.
bringing a lot of genius in, but we've got to protect them. We've really got to nurture these starseed children so they have a chance to do what they came to do. Otherwise, we're worse than screwed. It's just over. But
Absolutely, and I mean, actually, on that note, just briefly, so I wrote an ebook last year, and I've had many children read it, so, like, middle schoolers. I actually had a couple of middle schoolers do book reports on it and interview me about light for their school projects. I'm giving a talk to the New Hampshire School, Board of Education in June. I'm gonna be meeting with, like, 3 different sectors of them and try to help them curate better environments for their kids, frankly. And so I'm very hopeful that I can, start to chip away at least at some state level, local level, or even just at the level of individuals, helping to educate people just so they can do better for themselves, for their families, and then hopefully have that ripple out.
thank you.
It's my pleasure. I love talking with kids. I think and it also makes sense with them. And they're also a lot of the kids today were raised on iPads.
Yeah.
And so they don't even know, and they're being basically they're being dealt a shorthand from the get-go, not realizing that, this addiction, it's not only an addiction to these devices, but it's actually wearing down their biology, their dopamine systems, their ability to
Yeah.
think well, their ability to have, healthy mood and self-regulate and so many different aspects of and also puberty. We'll talk about light and puberty later, but early puberty is a major issue with a lot of blue light exposure early in life. It affects the leptin system, which is the
Mm-hmm.
primary hormonal system that dictates puberty onset, especially in girls, but also in boys to a certain extent. And so there's so much that these kids are being faced with, and they don't have any control over that environment. They're just being thrust into it. So we need to do our best to protect them, provide parents with good information, provide the kids with other alternatives so they can still enjoy technology without the trade-offs.
Many people today actually think the word myth is the equivalent of saying something's a lie, which is a very, very dangerous social conundrum that we're in, because really the word myth is synonymous with story. We are all living our story, which is our myth. It's very important to realize that your story creates the contextualization or the perception of what's happening in your life and why it's happening. So when we look at myth and we realize that myths come from a variety of different cultures all over the world, pretty much every culture, and myths were stories that were containers for their life experience that helped them understand the life process and how to navigate it and how to understand the different events such as birth, death, and things that are, inherent to life itself. Then you have a sense of who you are, and you can make meaning of the world from the context or the perspective of your myth. And with our new sense of who we are, which gives us a new worldview, we now, from the perspective of having a sense of who we are, can look back and see that many of our judgments, feelings, insecurities, fears, and anxieties were ultimately rooted in this sense of not knowing who we are or where we were going or why we were here or what we're doing here or what our innate genius is that we've come to the world to share. And when we actually look at ourselves from that vantage point, we can often see that there is a golden thread of meaning, and that the trauma, for example, that happened with mother or father gave us an awareness, if nothing else, of how we don't want to raise our own children, which can change the lives of our children. So actually, at the end of the day, when you look at how important myth is to our sense of who we are and our worldview and our ability to heal from a perspective of having a deeper sense of who you are, it changes your whole life. It's changed my life. It's changed the life of many, many of my patients and my students around the world. And I'm excited to be able to share this process with you, because I'm absolutely 100% sure that if you follow my lead and do what I teach in my upcoming myth workshop on how to create your own myth and live it, you will be amazed at the experience that you have, and you'll probably really enjoy all the amazing people that are in the process with us. And as I often suggest, use your heart to feel what you know. If you feel a pull and that this is the right time for you to enter this work and get into yourself and find your wholeness, then I'm excited to share this opportunity with you.
Paul's upcoming online workshop, Creating and Living Your Myth, is starting soon. This workshop is a combination of self-paced study and virtual group sessions with Paul, where he answers questions and guides you as you write your own myth. To find out more, go to paulchek.com/events. That's paulchek.com/events.
Yeah, the other thing that's causing all this early onset puberty is overexposure to xenoestrogens and
Absolutely.
soy-based products. I've done a lot of research into this. I will save it because I want to be able to get into your lessons on light. But the poisoning of the food supply, packaging food and chemicals,
Plastics.
using chemicals in food that are estrogenic.
Yeah.
And then all the veganism and overconsumption of soy-based products is another disaster. But you're going to give us a beautiful course in biology and circadian, light biology and circadian biology. So I'd like to just let you run with it. I'm going to be a student. I've left a few questions for you in the outline where I wanted to talk about some different concepts or things that might fit in or alternative views. So I'll try to gently break in where I can
Great.
but I now turn the wheel, helm, microphone over to you. Take us away, darling.
All right, here we go. So I just want to maybe set the stage by contrasting our current light environment with that of our ancestors, even just 200 years ago or less. So if we look at, before that rollout of the electrical grid, which was around the late 1800s, 1890 something was the 1893 World's Fair, the rollout of modern electricity and the electrification of the home that really started in the early 1900s. But prior to that, the primary source of light in the environment was the sun, which has specific wavelengths within it, which we'll talk about. And of course, we have moonlight, starlight, and firelight. But outside of that, no light bulbs, no screens, none of this. So fast forward, we're now in the modern age. We are now living over 90% of our days indoors for the average person. Within that indoor space, we are now really, really pushing the energy efficient lighting and technology. So these would be things like LED bulbs, LED screens, fluorescent bulbs, and energy efficient windows, all of which create light environments that are completely different from that which we would experience naturally. So sunlight, the terrestrial sunlight that reaches us ranges from ultraviolet UV up through infrared IR. UV and infrared are non-visible, so we can't see them with our eyes, but the Roy G. Biv that people may remember from grade school, that's the visible spectrum. It's present in sunlight. Midday sunlight is about 50% red and infrared light, around 10% UV light. That varies throughout the year depending on what latitude you're at, and about 25% blue light. So that blue light in midday sun is very, very important because it has a direct impact on our circadian biology. As it turns out, blue light is the signal that our brain and our eyes are looking for to understand something about the time of day. So there's a structure in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN. It is looking for blue light in the environment in order to keep time well. And that blue light, which is worth noting that this blue light is not only just, blue, but we're meant to receive it in the right spectrum. So, like I mentioned, midday sun's over 50% red and infrared. So we're always receiving blue light with an abundance of red and infrared light. And we're going to get into the differences between these, frequencies on our bodies. But suffice to say for now that compare that with our indoor environments, our LED bulbs, our fluorescent bulbs, all of our device screens, our TVs, computers, tablets, phones, they're all highly enriched in blue light, and they're completely devoid of red and infrared light, because the push towards energy efficiency is basically saying we only want our phones to make visible light, or our screens or our light bulbs to make visible light that is short wavelength, that then avoids these longer wavelengths of infrared light, which is also known as heat. So in energy efficiency, we're trying to minimize heat off gassing into the environment because it's seen as a waste product. Meanwhile, infrared light and UV light actually need to be seen as essential nutrients for the body. In the same way that we think about specific nutrients coming in through food, our bodies also need specific wavelengths of light in order to function properly, especially within the mitochondria, which are, people will know about them as the powerhouses of cells. But mitochondria are also electromagnetic antennas and electromagnetic emitters as well. So they're sensing the electromagnetic environment, which is not only the UV, infrared, and visible light, but also radio frequencies, the non-native EMFs that we're constantly bathed in today, including Wi-Fi, 5G, 4G, Bluetooth, etc., is a whole other portion of the light spectrum that is completely novel. In nature, without any of that technology developed, we get a very, very small fraction of radio frequencies from outside, but most of that is scattered throughout our solar system. It's not coming through our atmosphere and interacting with our bodies. So to fully paint this picture, we're in this non-native alien light environment that our biology has no idea how to interpret relative to what it's expected to receive over the course of our evolutionary or ancestral landscape, which was the sun, moon, stars, firelight, lightning, some bioluminescence, but by and large, the sun is the primary source of light in that environment.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
Have you ever read Arthur Thurston's book, The Invisible Rainbow?
Yes.
So one of the things that I never really hear anybody talking about in these light discussions is the fact that almost the entire globe is now saturated with radar frequencies. I mean, we've got very high power military radar systems. You've got them in satellites. And Arthur Furstenberg talked about in the Black Forest in Germany, how when they put up a new radar system for the military there, that it actually killed a massive amount of the forest all around the broadcasting, you know how the radar turns, everywhere that thing was broadcasting, it killed all the trees for miles and miles.
Mm.
So I'm curious, you know, with the mitochondria being a antenna system, and I left notes later to talk about it, but the DNA is also a cosmic antenna system with a vast frequency receptivity.
Mm.
What do you think all this radar must be doing to us and to our mitochondria, to our DNA, and to our cells and to our health?
Totally. Yeah, I think any of these non-visible frequencies that are very real, but we can't see them because we're very limited in our ability to see life. Like our senses are extremely limited. I mean, you can even look at other species. They're able to see way more than us. A
Like
lot of species
bees.
can see, yeah, bees can see UV light. Even dogs can see UV light. A lot of other critters can see ultraviolet light, but we're basically just very restricted in our ability to sense the world. And I think our bias then is to think if we can't see it, it doesn't matter. And it's like couldn't be further from the truth. And if we look at, mitochondrial function today compared to, even just 100 years ago, we can see that mitochondrial dysfunction and the failure of these mitochondrial engines is to blame for every chronic disease state that we're facing, from obesity to neurodegeneration, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, gut disorders, IBS, IBD, liver dysfunction, cirrhosis. Like every disease that we're facing societally is rooted in failing mitochondrial engines, and it's just a perfect negative synergy between whether it's the radars or other non-native EMFs and the food and the chemicals in the food and the fakeness of the food and the poor quality light environments and the chemicals we're spraying for our monocrop agriculture, and it's just all of these insults at one time. But for the radar specifically, I think it's just an additive effect with other non-native EMFs would be my guess, because you're basically muddying the signal that the mitochondria are receiving in order to properly interpret the environment and create um, the reasonable or the helpful output in order to support the organism. So I think, hopefully, I didn't mention this earlier, but I'm in the process of funding and building out my light lab, which will be a decentralized research lab that is not funded by federal funds. It's completely privately funded, where we can actually ask a lot of these questions related to circadian and light biology and mitochondrial biology and do good quality research. Because as the fact remains, and we'll kind of get into it a little bit later, but none of our research has light controls. We're doing all of our research, whether it's cancer models in rodents or research in humans, under awful garbage light, junk light. I like to equate, we talk about junk food, but junk light is just as bad. It's this LED and fluorescent crap that is directly modulating our metabolism. We know that just having somebody sit under fluorescent lights or LED lights will raise their blood sugar and their insulin completely independent of any food coming into their mouth. And so simply through that, mechanism, if we're doing our research under these light environments, then we're skewing the data that we're getting. And so we need to revisit a lot of fundamental studies when it comes to actually getting data that's relevant to the real world and helping to get people back into natural light environments, or at the very least, helping them to optimize the indoor light environments by using something like incandescent light bulbs, which actually pretty closely mimic sunlight. They're full of infrared. They got a little bit of UV. They've got a decent amount of visible light. They're energy inefficient because they give off a ton of that infrared non-visible light. But again, that is an essential nutrient for our bodies, and maybe we can just touch on it briefly here. Infrared light and red light, when they interact with the mitochondria, actually stimulates ATP energy production and also metabolic water production. And that water that mitochondria make is really, really important for hydrating tissues at the tissue level and the cellular level. It's a special kind of water called deuterium depleted water. We'll probably talk about that a little bit later, but suffice to say for now that it's a special type of water that is really important for creating hydration within tissues and also structuring water within tissues. And this goes back to Gerald Pollack's work, the fourth phase of water. This gel state water is absolutely critical for facilitating metabolic reactions. It essentially acts like a battery within cells. And most people think about ATP as the cellular energy currency. But when I was in grad school learning about ATP and, top metabolism research lab, we always talked about ATP and free energy. But free energy never sat right with me. It's like, what is this nebulous concept of free energy? How's it actually working? And when we actually dig down to how it's working, what it looks like it's happening now with our updated information from Pollock's work is that water is being charge separated into exclusion zones, which is it's called EZ water. It's the same thing as gel state or fourth phase water. And this charge separated water literally serves like a battery. So the way a battery works is by separating positive from negative charge and creating a potential energy that can then be discharged in order to power, your remote control or your phone or whatever it is. Mitochondria actually work the same way by separating electrons from protons, electrons being negative charge, protons being positive charge. In doing so, also creating a battery that then, powers the production of ATP and metabolic water. But when we're looking at the free energy, so to speak, that ATP is producing, what it's actually doing is it's donating a phosphate group to, let's say, an enzyme in, I don't know, pick your favorite pathway, glycolysis, the sugar breakdown pathway. That phosphate group is changing the shape of the enzyme, which then allows the water that's charge separated to go into new pockets within that enzyme to actually catalyze the reaction. So what ATP is doing is just helping to facilitate the processes that water is actually directly charging and powering. And so I think when we're thinking about cellular hydration and water and the role of the mitochondria play in this way, becomes really clear that aging is a disease of dehydration. Essentially, aging is a disease of mitochondrial failure over time. As mitochondria become dysfunctional, we basically make less water, we hydrate the tissues less. The water that you drink is important, but the water that your cells make is really what creates that very well hydrated cellular environment that's able to engage in metabolic processes. And so I really like to think about the aging process as mediated by mitochondrial dysfunction that's leading gradually to this cellular dehydration that is ultimately going to lead in, failure of the tissue or the organ over time, just a matter of time of getting there. But I also really like to focus on mitochondrial medicine in general, and this is a lot of the work of Dr. Doug Wallace at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, who's the one who discovered that you inherit your mitochondrial DNA from your mom specifically. And so that egg that becomes you is full of mitochondria that can then, multiply and partition into different organ systems as you're developing in utero. And depending on, mom's lifestyle, but also grandma's lifestyle, because the egg that would become you was already present in mom's ovary when she was in your grandmother's womb.
Right.
And so your grandma is also directly affecting your health, like her lifestyle, her stressors, her traumas, her environment are already affecting you before your mother is even born. And so I really like to think about that maternal lineage as kind of an ancestral trauma, like the lineage by which things propagate through generations. But we have a lot of autonomy over that because there are two processes that occur within mitochondria: mitophagy and mitochondrial biogenesis. Mitophagy is the process by which damaged mitochondria are selectively removed from a cell. And mitochondrial biogenesis is the process by which the mitochondria that remain are able to divide and make new ones of themselves. And so by optimizing our environments and the inputs into our bodies to make those processes work really well, now what we can essentially do is age in reverse. We can get rid of the bad mitochondria and multiply the good ones. And now what we're left with is a colony of mitochondria that have been rejuvenated, that have been purified. And so I think it's just such a more empowering perspective relative to the nuclear DNA perspective, where it's like you're born with a set of genes, you may have mutations that will, cause XYZ disease in your life, and you have no power over it unless you take our, like, gene therapy, and maybe we can help you then. But actually, when we take a step back, we can actually see that through Doug Wallace's work, he showed actually mitochondrial function is directly affecting the nuclear genome. If the mitochondria become dysfunctional, it changes the epigenetics within the nuclear genome, which genes are methylated, which ones are basically turned on or off expression wise. It also changes rates of mutation. So if you're mitochondrial dysfunctional, then you are more susceptible to getting mutations within the nuclear DNA. So everything is basically pointing down to if we can optimize our mitochondria, we can really optimize our life. And because the light environment is such a crucial input into the mitochondria, Jack likes to talk about light, water, magnetism as the three-legged stool that's responsible for helping to shape healthy mitochondria. By really nailing those down, we can build a foundation of health that will then allow us to, when we're eating a good diet, we now have the mitochondria to actually use those nutrients effectively. If our mitochondria are failing, we could eat a great diet, but if we're in a really crappy environment and we're super stressed out and we're not sleeping and our circadian's out of whack, it's not going to be enough to actually prevent disease. I feel like you might have a question. You want to pop in?
I do. I have a few. some questions, some requests for your thoughts.
Mhm.
I did a great podcast with Dolph Zantinga. Are you familiar with Dolph Zantinga? One of the
No.
world's top researchers. He ran Fritz Albert Popp's biophoton lab for
Oh,
12
amazing.
years, and I believe 12 years. And one of the things he found is that when you put a cell phone next to water, it destructures the water and basically wipes it out.
Wow.
And he expressed great concern for all these 5G towers, satellites, because he said it could completely damage the water of our oceans and destructure the water. And he said he was doing more research on that. But, one of the things that I haven't heard you talk much about, but I'd like to hear your thoughts of is, water is extremely receptive. Water is receptive to 65 octaves of vibration, which is a number so big we don't even have a word for it. It's approaching infinite. So water is affected and responds to psychic energy, to sunlight, to pretty much anything, chemistry. And we're 99.999 to about the 12th decimal point water by molecular count. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on the light-water relationship and the light-water mitochondria interconnection, because we are really far more water than anything else. And so when you understand the sciences of water, like you've mentioned the fourth phase of water in Pollack's work, but there's, in my upcoming Spirit Gym book series, I have 3 comprehensive chapters on water, and it'll probably blow people's minds when you look at the research on water. So there's that connection. And I'll let you go there, and then I got a couple more. I don't want to overload you with too many questions in a row. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, though. I mean, for
Great.
example, just to give you an example, like I recently had a very nasty case of COVID. My soul told me I got it from vaccine shedding. So I actually got the vaccine, which then carried the bioweapon in it. And it was freaking gnarly. I lost so much weight. My underwear were falling off. I couldn't eat for 5
Wow.
days. I was fighting off the darkest, ugliest entities that were attached to that vaccine.
Ugh.
I'm actually going to do a podcast. My soul directed me to do a podcast called Spiritual Healing from COVID, because there's so much stuff coming in from the astral dimension and the dark side of the astral dimension that's encoded in that vaccine and the virus.
Wow.
Which I don't know is a virus. It's a bioweapon for sure. But the point I'm getting at is that my body craved the sunlight. I had to be in the sunlight, which Fauci told people not to do, not surprisingly. And the weather was pretty nasty. We had like 4 power outages in a short period of time. We had very high winds. This is when the fires were going on.
Mm.
But right behind my office here, which is a beautiful guest house, that's our guest house that we turned into our office, the house has been blasted out of the side of the mountain, so it sets into the side of the mountain. So I got like 15-foot rock walls all around the house.
Wow.
And the sun shines right down through there through most of the day. So even though the wind was blowing, it was kind of crazy. There's like a still spot. And I used to have a jacuzzi out there, which I got rid of. So I got this beautiful stone patio. And I would just lay there and take my clothes off. And it was like my body was just drinking that sunlight in. It was like I knew this was the medicine my body needed. And I was out there pretty much every day. It was like this body was saying, go get in the light. So I think, that you couple that with the water. And then so I'm just curious as to your thoughts on that combination of light, maybe sunlight, water, mitochondria, DNA, whatever rises up out of you.
Yeah, there's so much I could say, but with the light and the water piece, for now, let's talk about that. So in Pollack's work, he showed that 3100 nanometer light, which is in the far infrared range, was particularly efficient at creating exclusion zones, like that charge separation. And so typically that's people will cite, you need far infrared light, which you get from full spectrum sunlight. You're only getting it from full spectrum sunlight. There's no other sources of it, and in nature or man-made, I'm sure we can, if you get like a sauna space bulb, for example, you can get some far infrared. But by and large, sunlight is a great source for that. But the thing is, with his research, he used bulk water. And so I actually have a colleague at Northwestern University who's running a water lab who recently fell down the rabbit hole and all the light stuff. And she's running some experiments, first repeating his stuff, but then we're going to go and look at deuterium depleted water because, like I mentioned, deuterium depleted water is what's being made by our mitochondria. And the cellular environment is mostly this deuterium depleted water. There is some exchange, of course, with the serum, which is being influenced by the bulk water that we're drinking. But because the deuterium levels are lower within the cellular environment, we need to know which frequencies actually will affect that water as well, because it's going to likely be different. And our guess is that UV light is going to play a stronger role in the deuterium depleted water relative to the bulk water. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see both, because when we think about the bioenergetics of the body, it's really UV and infrared light are the stars. And you mentioned Fritz Pop's work. Even before Fritz Pop, you probably know about Alexander Gurwitch and his onion root experiments. So he, in the 20s, the 1920s, showed that essentially what happens if you cut an onion in half and put a piece of normal glass in between the onion slices, nothing happens. But if you put a piece of quartz glass in between the onion slices, suddenly now you get sprouting out
Mm.
of out of each respective slice. And he termed this mitogenetic radiation, but we ended up actually finding out in later studies with photomultipliers and being able to actually measure the spectra of the light being produced that it's actually UV light. And he also predicted that based on the fact that quartz glass permits UV light to pass through it and regular glass does not. And so even, back then we knew that there was this role of cell division and UV light, and that actually when cells divide, they release UV light from the DNA. Now, there's also biophotons made from the mitochondria as well in the UV range. Importantly, in both the DNA and in the mitochondria, light that's stronger than the sun can be made. So UVC photons. Most people think UVC, that's not even, it's in sunlight, but it gets reflected back out into space. We never get it on Earth. And because UV light has been so demonized, and we're going to get into why it's ridiculous and the research is bunk and how important the different frequencies of UV light are, but suffice to say for now that UVC light is actually made within our cells and it's stronger than the light of the sun. And that UVC light is made both through cell division and like the mitosis process and the replication of DNA, but also through energy production in the mitochondria. So there's something called the electron transport chain, which is responsible for making ATP and metabolic water. It's a series of protein complexes that essentially shuttle electrons along. And they also pump protons to make that gradient between like the protons and the electrons. And that's what creates the battery that allows the ATP synthase to make ATP. So if anybody goes on YouTube and looks up ATP synthase, there's really cool renderings where you can see ATP synthase is an actual rotor that spins, and as it
Mm.
spins, ATP gets made from ADP and free phosphate. And it's the most efficient motor that we've ever discovered in nature. It's basically 100% efficient. It's crazy.
The
Um,
RPM on that thing is really high, isn't it?
it's super high. I believe it makes 3.4 ATPs per turn. I don't remember off the top of my head how fast it spins, but it's crazy
It's in the
fast.
thousands. I know. I've studied it
Yes.
a long time ago. It's like crazy high.
It's super fast. There's basically no loss to friction. It's super efficient. It's like we can't even fathom how they're able to do that. And meanwhile, when we build motors and rotors, it's like we lose a ton to heat, essentially, a ton of energy
Yeah,
to heat.
friction. Yeah.
Yeah, but as those electrons are getting shuttled along these proteins in the ETC, the electron transport chain, biophotons are produced. So these biophotons are largely in the ultraviolet and the infrared range. Also, if you ever get an infrared camera, you can look at somebody on it because we emit a
Uh,
ton of infrared light.
I was a paratrooper. I used to use infrared scopes. I know exactly what you can see.
Exactly. Yeah. So it shouldn't be a surprise, like that we are actually light beings and we've known this for a long time. Like we're making heat. We just can't see it as light because our vision isn't able to detect infrared light as light, but it is very much there. And same with UV light. So our mitochondria are making a ton of these biophotons. If you look in the literature, it's typically called ultra weak biophotons. And it's mostly because we don't have a really good way of detecting these photons actually in the body. We're only looking at what the body emits. But
Hmm.
interestingly, Roland Van Wyck's work, and I believe his son also has kind of carried the torch on this, shows that as you get older and as you become ill, you release more photons from your body. So if you look at somebody with a photomultiplier and you measure the amount of light coming off of them, if you're sick, or if you're old, you waste more light into your environment. And if you're young and healthy, you're able to actually retain that light and use it productively. And this also kind of ties back in with the Alexander Gurwich's work, who really set off the light biology world. But that was kind of also picked up by Albert St. Georgi, who won the Nobel Prize in
Mm-hmm.
1939 for vitamin C. But he actually had a pet theory about basically that the DNA in our bodies encodes proteins with electronic structures. And his hypothesis was that basically all the proteins in our body are semiconductors.
Yeah, I believe it.
Yeah, and so that ended up influencing the work of Robert O. Becker, who wrote The Body Electric.
Mm-hmm.
He was in med school at the time, and Albert St. Georgi gave this commencement speech at his graduation, and it ended up inspiring his entire career. So after that, he started a lab that was actually fully funded by ARPA and DARPA, to look at the influence of electromagnetism in wound healing, limb regeneration, and he essentially set out to prove that indeed the body is made of semiconductors, and he was successful in doing that. He
Mm-hmm.
found that basically P and N type semiconductors, P type being like in bone specifically. In bone, we have the collagen network is the P type semiconductor, the apatite is the N type semiconductor, and that bone is actually a light emitting diode, an LED, that emits red brown light. Super interesting. And he did an incredible amount of work in this space. He was on track to actually be able to facilitate limb regeneration in like wounded vets and things like this. But what ended up happening was that his research got completely defunded after he went and blew the whistle on 60 Minutes. I believe the year was 1967, because the military was putting up these sanguine antennas that were emitting a ton of non native EMFs. And part of his research was to study the effects of non native EMFs on limb regeneration, wound healing, and biology in general. And he found, animals getting tumors, wound healing being disrupted, lots of nasty effects from these frequencies. And he was publishing for months and years on this stuff, and it wasn't being archived. He ended up going and checking, and it wasn't being archived by the military's records. And so he went and blew the whistle on 60 Minutes, and within 2 days, his career was ruined. All his funding was pulled. He lost his livelihood, his career, and he became a pretty bitter old man over the course of years. He died in 2009, but Jack Cruz actually had the opportunity to go and speak with him for a few days in 2008. And he apparently, over those few decades after he had lost his career, done a lot of research to understand who actually was behind him getting all that funding pulled and what actually happened, like why it happened. And so there's a whole bunch of nefarious stuff behind that. But
Well, who
anyway,
was it?
well, so it's a long story, but it basically goes back to General Groves and the Manhattan Project and the siloing of science and medicine in order to allow scientists to work on projects without knowing the bigger picture of why they're working on the
Oh, yeah.
project.
Yep.
And so that siloing continued on, and it was found within the military industrial complex to be very useful to be able to operate science in this way and basically use scientists as pawns for bigger projects that could be extremely destructive without them having to be complicit in knowing the actual goal of the whole project, as an entity. And so it kind of is related to that. It was basically military industrial complex players that were behind pulling his funding. And so that canceling, he was one of the first canceled scientists. That canceling set us back like over 40 years in non-native EMF research. And on top of that, there's all these propaganda campaigns to like gaslight and silence people who even talk about this stuff, like as if they're like woo and like crazy for even thinking it. Meanwhile, Becker has done extensive work before he got canceled. His book, The Body Electric, his book, Cross Currents.
I've got them all.
Um,
I studied them all.
yeah. Also, Dr. Andrew Marino's work. He came on my podcast a few weeks ago. He was a student in Becker's lab in the 50s, and he did a lot of the studies showing the harms of non native EMFs. And he ended up continuing a lot of that research when he became a professor at the University of Louisiana, I believe. Um, and so he had a lot of great insights in his book, Going Somewhere: The Truth About a Life in Science. It's not only a great book from a scientific perspective to understand like how nasty and gnarly these frequencies can be for biology, not only human biology, but animals and plants, but also the politics and the inherent issues with the way that science is structured now that actually prevents scientists from doing good science. So I would really recommend people check that book out. But anyway, the
Can I make a
Yeah.
quick point?
Please.
his his research that got him in trouble was warning us of exactly what's happening right now.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
Tumors and diseases and all the shit that he was saying, hey, this is what's happening, that they
Yes.
buried. It was the 40-year advanced prediction of what's fucking happening today.
Exactly, and it makes perfect sense when you think about that. The interests of the system as a whole didn't want this information out because they have their, 10, 20, 30-year goals of getting this technology out, and a lot of that tech was being developed, decades before it ends up rolling out. For example, Marcel Vogel, who we'll probably talk about later, he worked on
Mhm.
developing LCD screen technologies at IBM, even though they didn't come out for, like, 20 years after that, so a lot of this stuff was in the works way before it rolled out, and I think Dr. Jack Kruse talks about this a little bit as well, that, like, when he blew the whistle on 60 Minutes, it didn't really resonate with people that much because people didn't have cell phones, they didn't have Wi-Fi, like, they barely had microwaves.
They
It
were
was
too
like,
far behind,
yeah, exactly. So people were like, "Okay, what is this non-native EMF business? Like, is it really affecting me?" Not really. My day-to-day life, I don't have this stuff in my home. I'm probably fine. Meanwhile, now, there's 5G towers on every block. Everybody has a Wi-Fi router in their home. They're carrying their wireless devices on them.
cell phones
Uh,
to their head.
Cell phones to the head, Bluetooth connecting their AirPods to their
Yeah,
phones.
yeah.
And after this podcast, if somebody listening does nothing else, when you go out in public, just make a note of all the people wearing sunglasses and AirPods, and you will just be astounded. And you'll understand by the end of the episode why both of those are a bad idea. I mean, from the AirPods perspective, it relates directly what we're talking to. We're basically concentrating non-native EMF waves into the mitochondria in the inner ear and to the brain. That's the last place you want those frequencies to be, especially in developing children. So when I see kids with AirPods,
It's
that
crazy
is
shit.
that's gonna be akin to child abuse in 10 years when we know the horrors of what actually is going on
Yeah.
and it becomes public knowledge. That's gonna be seen as, like Jack says, kicking the shit out of your kid in, like, a parking lot. It would be the same thing. You're basically, if you sit them on an iPad with AirPods in their ears, you're setting them up for a lifetime of illness and
Yeah.
mental illness and physical illness.
Hello, my fellow spiritual warriors and world workers. I hope you're enjoying this podcast as much as I am. It is no secret that today we are not only bombarded with so-called health and fitness information from every angle, be it social media, TV, podcasts, etc., but clearly it's not working. Many studies conducted worldwide show that children, teens, adults, and the elderly are the most unhealthy, overweight, and the sickest they've ever been. But it does not have to be that way for you. When I wrote my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, I researched the number of diet books available at that time, and there were over 5,000 of them, each claiming to have the right diet for anyone and everyone. But the reason I wrote How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy was because these books all overlook the fact that no two people are the same, and therefore no two people are likely to get good results on the same diet. That's simply fact. Another reason the myriad of diet approaches available today fail so often is that they don't look at the underlying causes that lead to body health and mental emotional challenges. They treat the human being as though it were a machine, and all you need to do is add this liquid or that supplement, and presto, the machine runs again. These issues are more important than ever considering the physiological, mental, emotional, environmental stress and toxicity in the world today. Today, it is critical to learn the essentials of how to eat, hydrate, breathe, cultivate life force energy, and use your mind to create the life you've always wanted to live. This is exactly what you will learn in our upcoming Holistic Lifestyle Coach Level 1 training program, live with my wife and master instructor, Angie Chek. This workshop is designed for anyone that genuinely wants to be healthy and is ideal for fitness enthusiasts, athletes, and parents. It's also a great chance to explore and see if you want to move into our Holistic Lifestyle Coach Level 2, which is our professional level training, and pursue a career as a holistic lifestyle coach today when it is so desperately needed. Not only will you be taught by Angie Chek, one of the most knowledgeable experts in holistic health in the world, I will make guest appearances and answer questions. HLC1 is a rare opportunity to take HLC1 training live at our beautiful Rainbow home atop of a mountain in Fallbrook, California with beautiful views, and you get to enjoy my amazing stone-charged water and work out in my beautiful gym. If you want to meet other holistically minded people and grow your conscious community, there's no better place than our live workshops. In this important, practical 3-day training program, you will learn how to apply the 1, 2, 3, 4 approach to developing long-term body-mind changes and how to apply the 5 essential program design factors. Learn to use your Chek nutrition and lifestyle questionnaires for assessing physiological load and making essential diet and lifestyle changes. Understand the relationship between the 6 Chek foundation principles and body-mind stress. Learn how to apply the 6 Chek foundation principles to balance your body systems so you can exemplify well-being. Identify common roadblocks to success with diet and lifestyle modifications and gain simple solutions. Discover how to use the less is more principle of exercise prescription. I'm sure this will be a life-changing workshop for anybody that attends, and I look forward to seeing you all here at our beautiful home in Fallbrook, California. Enjoy.
HLC1 with Angie Chek will be held on May 30th to June 1st, 2025. To learn more and to register, go to chekinstitute.com/core. That's CHEK institute.com/CORE. Don't miss this only opportunity to take HLC1 live and in person with Angie this year.
There's 2 other things I wanted to bring up. In Sayer G's book that he published maybe a couple of years ago, I can't remember the title of it now, but he gives the amount of energy, electrical energy produced by one mitochondria and then calculates it based on the estimated number of mitochondria in the body. And it turns out that we have more electricity in our body from our mitochondria than the sun produces in energy.
Yes.
Which is pretty wild. And many years ago, probably 15 years ago, I've been buying courses from the teaching company. They've changed their name a couple of times. The Great Courses Company, the teaching company. It's all university professors, and they do all these courses. I got hundreds of them, studied tons of them. But they would send out, this is back in the days of cassettes, they would send out a free sample of a presentation by anyone that was making a new course. So you'd get these kind of sample things. And one of them was a Cambridge professor or graduate of Cambridge. And he actually, in that presentation, it was on energy and the energy in the human body. He said there is far more energy in every single human body than the sun puts out. And that was a long time ago. And he had got all that, he'd calculated it all mathematically and gave all the rationale behind it. But that was the first time I'd ever heard that. So when Sayer G calculated the total amount of energy produced by mitochondria being more than the sun's putting out, I thought that's important for people to realize, because it really shows you that we are very advanced technology that's produced by the entire cosmos and whatever is behind it. Some people call it gods, whatever you want to call it. But I think it's important for people to realize it's a miracle to have a human body.
Absolutely.
Yogananda says at any given moment, there are 60 billion souls waiting for a human body to come be on Earth. And if you knew how amazing it was to have a human body, you'd be dancing in the street. And so I think it's just, I think the reason I bring that up is because a lot of people so assume their body and they don't realize the amazing gift it is to have one. And if you did, people take better care of their cars and their gadgets than they do their body. And it's always just been mind-boggling to me. The other thing I wanted to share is that, I've been doing this for a very long time, as you know, and I owned a physical therapy clinic for 3.5 years. I worked in the largest one in San Diego for 4 years. I worked with a chiropractor taking care of mostly injured athletes for 2 years. And a lot of these people had been put on heavy courses of antibiotics, and it severely affects their energy production. A lot of athletes have a very hard time coming back to normal energy output and performance after being on any kind of a real course of antibiotics, which tons of them have had to go through. But one of the books in my library that I was studying showed studies that showed very conclusively that within as little as, I think it was 3 weeks of aerobic exercise, you could get a 300% increase in mitochondrial populations in your body. So I think it's important for people to realize, especially if you've taken antibiotics, that not that I'm a big promoter of aerobic exercise. I think they never tested weightlifting, but I think getting physical and getting your body moving is very important to the mitochondria. I wondered if you have any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I to circle back to your first point, I think it's really useful to think about our mitochondria as like mini suns inside of us because
Mm-hmm.
that's what they're producing. They're producing electromagnetic frequencies. They're also sensing the electromagnetic frequencies. So both are equally important. When we start to see mitochondria that way, it will become much more easy to engineer environments that are conducive to mitochondrial health because now we're actually clear on what they're doing versus like, oh, they just make energy. Like that doesn't actually tell you about how to craft an environment that's supportive of them. Um, but with regards to mitochondria, there's so much that I could say, and there's also different types of mitochondria, and we need to talk about how to optimize mitochondrial health in general. And exercise is a huge one. The light piece also is huge. As it turns out, blue light actually impairs mitochondrial function. So on your skin, eyes, proximal brain regions, if you shine blue light, it actually slows down the mitochondria.
Do you mean the blue light from the sun or the blue light from screens?
Specifically, artificial light,
Yeah.
because as it turns out, 25% of midday sunlight is blue light. Over 50% of is red and infrared light. The red and infrared light actually stimulates mitochondrial function. So what
Mm-hmm.
nature is telling us is that whenever there's blue light, we're meant to receive an abundance of red and infrared light with it to counterbalance the
Right.
effect on the mitochondria. So when we're inside, under our LED fluorescent lights on our screens, behind window glass, all of those stimuli are creating a blue light toxic environment. Let's say, if we think about light as nutrients, we're all overdosing on blue light and we're highly deficient in infrared and UV light. And even just if you're sitting inside behind glass without any lights on at all, window glass blocks 100% of UVB light, 30% of UVA light, almost all of near infrared light because of, again, it's energy efficient. So we're basically trying to keep heat from coming through the glass to maintain the, crisp 70-degree indoor temperatures that people live at year round. And so in effect, what you're doing is even if sunlight's coming through that glass, you're filtering out a lot of the beneficial frequencies, in effect concentrating that blue light part of the spectrum. So even just cracking a window a little bit is really helpful in order to help give some of that frequency back, that healing infrared and UV. But when it comes to optimizing mitochondria, the mitochondrial biogenesis and mitophagy, so on the biogenesis side of things, you talked about aerobic exercise. That's definitely one way to do it. Exercise in general is going to be very supportive. Even just walking is going to be super supportive to mitochondrial biogenesis. UV light also plays a role in mitochondrial biogenesis, as well as in the regulation of mitosis, autophagy, and apoptosis.
Which is
And
cell death.
exactly, yeah. So for the maintenance of basic cellular function, we really need a healthy balance of autophagy and apoptosis. Autophagy being basically the cellular cleanup crews come in and get rid of the trash and can repurpose it into, other useful endeavors. And the apoptosis part is targeted cell death. Like you said, cells that are damaged beyond repair can be taken out for the greater good of the tissue, the organism. And light plays a really important role in both. So in autophagy, red and infrared light is particularly important. Same with mitophagy, as the names are quite similar. Mitophagy is basically when the damaged mitochondria specifically get taken to the woodshed or removed.
The woodshed, the garbage shack, the compost
Yes.
pile.
Yes, the compost pile. And autophagy is when like other cellular components get chewed up and reused. And so red and infrared light is highly enriched within morning and evening sun. So sunrise, over 80% of morning light is red and infrared. Same with sunset. And so if we're rising with the sun, like also let's assume that we're eating a more circadian diet, which means small dinner, more keto, carnivore-ish, about 4 hours before bedtime, which means we're getting into a good fat burning state overnight. When we wake up in the morning, if we're rising with the sun, we're now in a good low grade ketosis. Combine that with the red and infrared light coming from sunrise, you're completely supercharging the process of autophagy and mitophagy. If you want to combine that also with like a nice brisk morning walk, that will further enhance those processes to happen. So really, if we're thinking about optimizing these pathways, it's just kind of crafting a lifestyle that's conducive, and it's more or less intuitive as well. It's also in alignment with circadian biology. We
It's
should be.
also just in line with living naturally as we would
Yes,
have in nature.
right.
I
We
got
didn't have devices to keep us up all night.
I have two more things I want to add on the table for your input before we move on. One is in my parasitology books, which I've studied probably 50. Mitochondria are described as a symbiotic parasite, and they say that they're actually bacteria. I haven't heard you mention what the mitochondria actually are yet. Is that correct?
Yes. So there's a theory called the endosymbiont theory, which basically states that in early evolutionary history, there was a single celled organism that merged with a bacterium and they created this symbiosis and decided to basically stick together for the long term. And so, if we look at the structures of bacteria and mitochondria, they share a ton of similarities. They both have double membrane systems, they both have circular DNA. They both emit a ton of light. So bacteria also emit a ton of light. And actually,
Yeah,
one of the really important things that I want to study in the lab is actually what light frequencies different bugs in the microbiome are releasing. And
exactly.
perhaps that's actually the one of the more important outputs of these bacteria. Maybe it's not as much the chemicals. Like we often think about the chemicals they're producing, which actually can also be carriers for light. And we can talk about that in a little while. But essentially what I'm getting at is that the microbiome is likely influencing the colon cells and the neighboring immune cells largely via light frequencies and somewhat by chemicals, but there's probably a big role for light to play there. So I think there's this definitely a tight link between bacteria and mitochondria. Also, things that harm bacteria tend to harm
That's what
mitochondria.
I was going to say. We should
Yes.
really think about the management of bacteria in positive ways and consider that anything that's damaging to bacteria is probably going to damage the mitochondria, like antibiotics for one, and radiation, like we've been talking about, drugs. I mean, it's pretty fucking serious how deep into the completely fucking living backwards we've gotten.
It's literally a bizarro world, and I mean, a good example for antibiotics is the antibiotic ciprofloxacin, Cipro. It's really commonly associated with tendinopathies, like Achilles tears in
Mm,
particular, and whenever we see Achilles issues, it's a really good sign that somebody is, number 1, never getting their bare feet in contact with the earth or never getting grounded,
hmm.
and they have mitochondrial dysfunction because the mitochondria within those tendons and within the soleus, they're super mitochondrially dense, and when you take something like Cipro, it's really hurting not only the bacteria in your body, but those mitochondria as well. And it's making those tissues vulnerable. And that's just, a common example that people can experience. But antibiotics in general, although they are warranted in certain cases, they're highly overused and have a ton of trade offs that we need to be able to buffer against.
Yeah. And my last sidetrack question, not sidetrack, but these are things I'm curious of, and I got to ask you, um, what are the best lights that you do recommend? Like in my office here, it is LED lights, but I have biogeometry through the whole place, so it's pretty much neutralizing the negative electromagnetic effects. But I have had the urge to replace them with the best lights, but I haven't had a chance to ask someone like you, if you were going to replace the lights in your office, what would you put in there?
Great question. I have lots of thoughts on this, and biogeometry is great. We also have our whole home biogeometry as well. The only thing I would say there is that like we're neutralizing the harmful effects, but we're not providing the light nutrients or
Well,
like
that's why I'm
nutrition.
asking.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So what I would say is depending on what lights, are they can lights or are there bulbs that screw in?
Cans, they're cans.
Hmm.
There's probably 30 or 40 of them in here.
Okay, got it. So there's a brand called Block Blue Light that sells full spectrum can lights.
Okay.
So that would be one option. For people who have the can lights with a bulb that screws into it, you can get incandescent bulbs. So healthlighting.com is great. I highly recommend them. They make incandescent bulbs that are enhanced so they're a bit brighter. So for daytime use, we really want to get bright full spectrum light that has UV through infrared in the home, ideally. And so incandescent bulbs fit the bill there. Healthlighting.com also sells reptile basking bulbs that I love to use during the day throughout the house. They're bright white light, but they're warm. They have infrared and they also have a ton of UVA because the reptiles, like we know that the reptiles need infrared and UV, and somehow we think that evolutionarily we just kind of lost that, that necessity or that requirement, but we required it just as much as them. There's just a lot of propaganda around it, which we're going to get into.
And what's the reptile? Is that the name of the light bulb?
Yeah, so they're called Chromolux on healthlighting.com, and the bulb is called Reptile Basking Bulb.
Okay, I gotta find more room on my paper.
Yeah, so that's a really good one. They also sell a UVB reptile basking bulb, which I also use. We have it on like a reptile lamp. You need a high wattage lamp to hold that bulb, but it's also something good if let's say it's a cloudy day or you want some extra UVB light for your mood, mental health. A lot of people use sad lamps in the wintertime. They're not really going to cut it. They don't have UV light in them. So if you can get a light that actually provides that UV light, it's going to be huge from a mood perspective. That's kind of a spoiler alert because we're going to get into the effects of UV light in a little bit. But for now, definitely recommend that website. All their incandescent bulbs are great. Right now, I'm also using something called the Sky Portal from Chroma. So the light that I have, you may have noticed I made it a little bit more yellow.
I did, yeah.
Yeah, so it's flicker free, it's adjustable brightness and adjustable yellowness or amberness. So throughout the day, like midday, I can have it on bright white. They actually include specific wavelengths that are opsin stimulating, which basically means that they're stimulating the circadian pathway at the right frequencies. And then you can make it more amber throughout the day. They also have one that goes more red. And so it's very circadian friendly. Definitely recommend that for an office space as well. But the incandescent bulbs are definitely a really good go-to if you have a light fixture that has a screw-in bulb. I would recommend those.
Yeah, good, because just sort of the nature of my work and, my soul force is so strong that I rarely can stay in bed longer than about 3:30. So I typically get up at 3:30 in the morning so I have quiet time to do my spiritual practices before kids wake up and people start interacting with me. But I often have to do, mastery group meetings and podcasts for people in foreign countries. And I can end up working till 6 at night. And I find after about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, if I don't have enough brightness in the environment, I just feel tired. I don't want to try to jack myself up on caffeine and all this shit
Yes.
because of the long-term consequences. So I've been so busy. I've been thinking I've got to find the right light bulbs, and you are the one I felt, I've got to ask her this because I want to get all the lights in here set up so that I can use something that supports my need for work. And in evenings when I'm just tired from working lots of hours, so that I can get the support of the lights. But then when I go home, I can kind of transition into more of a downward slope.
So actually, on that note, from a circadian perspective, we talked about the importance of blue light for setting that clock. The absence of blue light at night is extremely important in order to allow melatonin to rise and cortisol to go down, which both cortisol and melatonin are circadian biosensors, I like to call them. Melatonin goes up when blue light goes away. Cortisol goes up when blue light comes around. So in the morning, when you go out for sunrise light into what's called UVA rise, and we'll get into that in a little bit, blue light is also coming into the spectrum and it's helping tell your body it's morning time. We need to turn on digestion. We need to turn on cognition. We need to turn on energy metabolism. All these things are happening. But light brightness is also a really important feature of circadian biology, whereby we want dim lights at night and we want bright lights during the day, as you alluded to. So most indoor spaces don't get over 1,000 lux of light, and lux is a metric that you can use to measure the brightness of light. It's adjusted for distance. So like basically if you have a really bright light, but you're standing 10 feet away from it, the lux of that light relative to you is pretty low. But if you stood next to it, it's a bright lux because it takes into account the distance between you and the source.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I mentioned that because if you go outside on a full sun day, clear day, you're getting over 100,000 lux of light.
Wow.
And if you're inside in just a typically lit room, you're getting around 1,000 lux or less. And so we really need that bright light during the day to keep our stimulating neurochemicals going, stimulate cognition, like you mentioned, help keep fatigue at bay, help you to think better, more clearly, and stay more focused. And so there's an app called the My Circadian app that has a lux meter on it. And it's kind of cool because you can use the camera on your phone to test the lux of your environment. And
Mm.
so you can use that to understand, okay, maybe I need to increase the number of lights that are directly around me in order to get up to around 10,000 lux is a good goalpost for stimulating cognition and focus and alertness for your office space. So I would recommend using that and just making sure you have enough light around you in order to reach around 10,000 lux.
Now, a question on that, and I know I'm asking personal questions, but I think if it's personal to me,
For
there's
sure.
countless people out there that are in similar situations in offices at night. Based on your research, what's the ideal number of hours to come down off? Like if I leave here, I typically go to bed at 8:30 to 9. I often get out of here between 5:30 and 6. Am I going to be able to come down off these lights in time to have my normal melatonin cycle in that span of time?
What time do you go to bed?
8:30 to 9 usually.
Okay. Yeah, so I would say at least you want at least 2 hours of, like, kinda dim light before you're going to bedtime, I would say at a minimum. So, basically, either that means modulating your light environment or popping on a pair of blue blocking glasses. You're wearing a pair of yellow ones. For the evening time, I'd recommend popping on a pair of dark orange ones because 'cause they're gonna block 100% of blue light. So, basically, what that could look like is right once you finish up working, pop on the pair of darker orange glasses so that you're now removing that blue light signal completely. And that will give your body time to ramp down cortisol and ramp up melatonin before bed. And typically, I would tell people, starting around sunset is when you want to start blue blocking, whether you're using red light bulbs in your home or you're wearing blue blocking glasses that are high quality. The dark orange lens is 100% blue blocking. Yellow lenses are around 60% blue blocking, so they're good for more daytime use if you're going to be somewhere that has harsh lighting. But I also always tell people if you can filter at the source, do that. So if you can change your light bulbs to be full spectrum, do that. If you can put iris or flux on your computer to filter blue light out at the source, you can do that. On your phones, you can do similar things. There's like native settings on Apple devices that you can modulate in order to make your phone amber or
Mm.
red throughout the day. I keep mine on amber all day and I keep my laptop on amber all day just to minimize the total dose of blue light in isolation that our body's receiving. And then when you can't do that is when you pop on a pair of glasses. But the one drawback to that is that our skin also has non-visual photoreceptors. So light is coming in through our eyes. It's extremely important. The light coming in through our eyes is definitely affecting our circadian system more, but our skin is also detecting the light environment. And so there's something called melanopsin, which is a blue light detector, as well as neuropsin, which is a UVA light detector. And both of those are on our skin and on our eyes. And so if we're exposing our skin to blue light, even if we're blocking it from our eyes, we're getting conflicting signals into the system. And so if you're going to be somewhere that has harsh lighting in the evening, let's say, also try to cover up your skin, long sleeve pants, as well as like popping on blue blocking
Hmm.
glasses if you can't change your light environment directly.
I studied a lot on circadian biology because I spent 25 years constantly moving on jet craft, lecturing all over the world. Penny and I made it around the world twice a year, every year for about 25 years. I was doing probably 100 lectures a year, typically moving constantly. And a lot of my courses are, a week to 10, now 12 days long. And so I got completely and utterly fucked up. I got to the point where I just didn't know when to pee, when to poop, when to sleep. I'd go to bed, I'd wake up wide awake in the middle of the night. I
Mm,
lost my sense of home. I started getting
mm,
depressed because my body was just so confused. And I ultimately went into a midlife crisis at 50. And I said to Penny, I'm going to have to stop traveling because if I go one step further, I'm going to end up getting cancer and destroy all the reputation I worked so hard to build. And I was doing
mm,
everything I could do, from Tai Chi twice a day, getting up with the sun, every trick I could throw at this. But I got to the point where I was just so exhausted from all this constant movement and jet travel. So I not only that, I had a lot of shift workers that had a lot of health problems. So I spent a fair time studying circadian biology. I got a lot of great books on it. And one of the things they mention is cryptochrome cells. And in sleep labs, they showed that all you got to do is shine like a laser pointer for doing slideshows on somebody's toe. And even though the rest of their body's completely covered, it'll wake them up because the cryptochrome cells, I thought they said they delivered the photons to the hypothalamus, but maybe I can't remember. But the question I had for you is, one, maybe you can mention the cryptochrome cells, what they do and how they work. But the question I was going to ask is related to the biophotons. Do you think we have cryptochrome cells on the inside?
Yeah, good question. So, photoreception is a really interesting area. And actually, so if we think about, I mentioned neuropsin and melanopsin, which are UV and blue light detectors, but water is actually a primary chromophore in the body for infrared light. So, water loves to absorb red and infrared light. And so, when we're thinking about chromophores or cryptochromes or anything that's interfacing with light, it goes so beyond like just like the opsins or the cryptochromes. It's actually like the molecules themselves in our bodies absorb different frequencies of light. And I also alluded to this earlier when I was talking about the microbiome producing chemicals that could carry light. So a lot of the metabolites made by the microbiome relates to aromatic amino acids like tryptophan, phenylalanine, tyrosine. They all have this ring structure in them. If somebody Googles it, you can see this six-membered ring structure. Whenever you see that ring, think UV light
Mm.
absorption. And so we have all of the different tryptophan and tyrosine and phenylalanine metabolites and proteins throughout the body. They're all absorbing UV light. And so there's different absorption spectra for all molecules within the system. And so I think it's actually a really interesting area of study that we'll probably look at in the lab is like how these different molecules are being charged up and what that actually means. And it also relates to something maybe that seems unrelated, but cannabis, for example, indoor grow versus
Yeah,
outdoor
big
grow. We know,
difference.
yeah, so we know like the terpenes and the cannabinoids, they have these ring structures that can absorb light, in particular UV light. But if you do an indoor grow, and most indoor lights, grow lights, don't have UV light in them, which means that you're missing basically the ability or the opportunity to charge up those molecules and deliver that light into your body. I think that's a whole area of research that we need to understand because if we just look at not only the nutrients within foods or the molecules within plants, but also what information they're carrying into the body via light, it's going to be, I think it's going to be pretty shocking when we begin to learn that and integrate it within our
I've
lifestyles.
been telling people for a very long time, Alexa, that you've got to stop thinking about food as just energy because food is information and it is
Totally.
telling your cells how to function. Every single thing that we would eat in nature has an intimate relationship. And, the Egyptians, thousands of years ago, identified that foods that look like the brain feed the brain, like a walnut. And
Hmm.
they would, kidney beans look like our kidneys. And this philosophy was poo-pooed by nutritionists. But a few years ago, I actually saw a research study done showing that the Egyptians had it right. And they analyzed all these foods based on this Egyptian concept and showed, sure enough, these nutrients actually feed these parts of the body. Just like research shows that when you eat glandulars, like if you eat the adrenal glands of an animal, they put radio marker dyes in them and showed they go directly to your adrenal glands. The body is very efficient. It won't repurpose or redistribute. It'll take a tissue that's already structured right for a particular, if you eat liver, it goes to your liver. And so I think that there's just so much natural wisdom out there that people have gotten trapped in. And that's one of the things that concerns me about so-called science is because a lot of time we get so caught in all the fancy dancy shit, we forget about just the basic down in the
Yes.
dirt, pay attention to the obvious, like the sun, and all that stuff. But anyhow,
Totally. Actually, on that note, really quick, one way that you can determine if organic food is actually like good organic food or it's just like says organic on the label isn't very good. If you happen to have the budget to get a photo multiplier, you can actually look at the amount of biophotons present in a food to understand how
yeah,
healthy that food is for you. So the food should be carrying more light if it's fresher and
yeah.
if it was grown more appropriately versus like, any packaged food is completely devoid of light. There's no biophotons in it.
Mhm.
The fresher food is gonna be full of light, and that actually is providing your body with information that it needs in order to process it and assimilate
Yeah,
it.
Fritz Albert Pop, probably the first one to really show that and show pictures of that. Um, there's another thing called a Brix meter that I bought years ago in my study of soil science. It measures the actual sweetness of any food. It actually measures it. And basically, what the research shows is that the higher the reading on the Brix, the healthier and the more vital the plant is. So if you compare like a bunch of broccoli and get the Brix reading, the healthiest broccoli will have the highest Brix reading. If you do a bunch of blueberries, so it's showing that basically they're concentrating the sun's energy into what the Brix is measuring. I can't remember exactly how they're doing it chemically. It's been years since I studied it, but I do have the meter and I did test it quite a bit. So there's a lot of ways that Mother Nature is supporting us, but we're kind of getting jerked off by all this bogus science. Just like I tell people all the time, don't forget every drug that's been taken off the market because it killed people was first scientifically validated. So these
Facts.
are dangerous things.
Yeah, so I really want to make sure we touch on light pollution. We talked about the importance of bright light during the day and darkness at night, but we didn't really talk about the implications of light at night outside of health. So, I mean, we mentioned blue light at night inhibits melatonin release, boosts cortisol production, which is preventing you from getting to sleep, getting good quality sleep, getting good recovery, etc. But light pollution at night also has other more, let's say, esoteric effects. So if we think about our ancestors' environments, even just 150 years ago, they go outside at nighttime, and as long as it's a clear night, they're getting a whole light show in the evening from the
Yes,
cosmos. You're able to see all of the galaxies and constellations, and it's just this vast cosmos that really puts into perspective our role and in the universe
that
to a
was
certain
their
extent. And that
television.
awe. Yes,
That was their
exactly.
entertainment and their education. That's where astrology came from.
Exactly, and we know, like, from all of the ancient sites that we've seen across the world, they are all oriented to specific, like, to the precession of the equinox or to specific constellations, where it's like clearly our ancestors were paying really close attention to the stars and to the cosmos. And now you go outside in a suburban or urban area and you can barely see anything anymore, and we lose that sense of awe, which is actually, I think it's really, really important for maintaining our spiritual health. So we're now losing that connection with the vastness of the universe and our place in it. And now the alternative is essentially materialism, and we see that playing out within our society. And it's ultimately a lack of meaning. And I think a lot of it actually stems from the light pollution at night tainting our relationship with the divine.
Amen. And many mystics have described God, and I've had this experience many times. God is translucent light. It's invisible light. But in high vibrational states, such as in deep meditation or shamanic journeys, I've actually experienced that light, and it's hard to. We don't really have language to describe it, but the experience would be that of unconditional love, the experience of being in that light, and it's what people describe when they talk about near-death experiences and merging with the light. And
Hmm.
so, that's what's behind it all, right? This is a esoteric sidestep, but just as you shine light through a prism and you get a rainbow, God shines its light through its own archetypes in the dream of itself, which creates the spectrum of light that creates matter and form. And so we're all living in the light of God, but to the degree that we become materialized, we lose consciousness of who and what we really are, and then we become objects. And that's really
Hmm.
what the transhumanism, Ahrimanic agenda is on the planet right now. That's what the vaccines do. They separate your soul from your body, and you just become an object of electromagnetic control, like a remote control car. So it's a very, very serious issue that's going on. And for those that haven't listened to my episode 250, Lucifer Christ Ahriman, I share Steiner's warnings about all this that's going on, and it's pretty shocking and profound, and he was bang on.
If you have listened to even one episode of Paul's podcast before, then you will know that he is passionate, and some would say even fanatical, about the quality of the food he eats and where it is sourced from. That is why the Chek household only eats pasture-raised meat, wild-caught fish, and organic produce. And that is why we subscribe to Wild Pasture's meat delivery service. Each month, Wild Pastures delivers a box of meat that has been raised by family farmers in the USA using regenerative farming practices. 100% grass-fed and finished beef, pasture-raised chicken, and pasture-raised pork, as well as wild-caught seafood. You can customize the selection in your box, add on extra when you know you will be feeding more people, or change your options each and every month. You might be thinking that this will be too expensive for you, but Wild Pasture's mission is to offer the highest quality meat at the lowest prices because they want to transform the meat industry. And that means that more people need to be able to choose meat that is raised right. Their pasture-raised animals are part of a natural ecosystem. Their farmers use rotational grazing, practices that mimic nature, and so do not need to use synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, hormones, or antibiotics. This beautiful process doesn't require the external resources, such as massive amounts of GMO grain, required with environmentally depleting conventional methods. And best of all, the meat and fish taste amazing. And for Paul's listeners, Wild Pastures are offering you 20% off your subscription for life, $15 off your first order, and free shipping. Seriously, you can't find a better deal for top quality pasture-raised meat. Go to wildpastures.com/Paul Chek. You don't need a promo code. Just visit wildpastures.com/Paul Chek and start choosing the goodies you will have delivered to you in your first box.
Yeah, and I mean, something that's come up for me while I've been learning about, well, the esoteric and the biological side of light is, is it malice or is it ignorance? And I think it's probably a bit of both. But if we look at the effects of like blue light in particular and all of our screen technology, so all of our screen devices are made with blue pump LEDs. So basically, it takes blue light and then it filters that blue light into other colors of the spectrum. And so if you look with a spectrophotometer at like our computer or phone screens or tablets or TVs, there's a huge spike in blue. And based on the patents from Google and Meta and others, we know that the companies that are making these products know that the blue light screen technology is highly addictive. So it hijacks your dopamine system. It makes you constantly want more of it. But what in essence it's doing by burning out those dopamine tracks in the brain is constantly keeping you wanting more for something, whether it's craving junk
Mhm.
food or pornography or sex or more screen time or whatever it is. There is this sense of lack that you're constantly trying to fill with more of something that is actually not the thing you need. And it actually ties really well in with the UV light story because, as it turns out, when we get full spectrum sunlight, so midday sun is highest in UV light, UVB light in particular is a really, really important frequency of UV light that's required for a healthy dopamine system. So when UVB light interacts with our eyes and our skin, it creates something called pro-opiomelanocortin or POMC in the brain and in the skin. And when it's made in the brain, in particular in the hypothalamus of the brain, which is what happens when UVB light interacts with our eyes and our skin, we are able to cleave this POMC prohormone into 10 different hormonal products. And one of them is beta endorphin, which is an endogenous opioid molecule that not only relieves pain, anxiety, depression, but also improves overall dopamine status and gives you a sense of fullness so that it's like you're no longer compulsively reaching for things to fill a void that is perceived versus, if you're getting full spectrum sunlight on your skin and your eyes, you're not blocking it with contacts, glasses, sunscreen, clothes, you're actually embracing that full spectrum light in the UV frequencies. It is giving you such a dopamine boost that it's like you're actually able to see things clearly because when you're constantly operating from a place of lack, you're constantly like you're basically operating out of need and not out of what is like in your highest truth
Yeah.
or what you actually
Mhm.
value. So it gives you space to pause and respond versus react to life.
Mhm.
And I think it's just so emblematic of what we're dealing with societally, like the systematic removal of UV light from the environment and its
Yeah.
demonization is resulting in our compulsivity, our materialism, and our basically the kind of spiritual void we're occupying in the absence of knowing, what being full actually
Yeah.
feels like.
Yes, because full people are naturally oriented toward freedom and sovereignty,
Yes.
and full people are very hard to control. And so
Yes.
that should give you an idea whether or not it's ignorance or intention.
Exactly. Yes. And so this campaign against UV light has been going on since roughly the 50s. the initial studies that were done on the harms of UV light, quote unquote, were done with UV light in isolation. There have never been any studies done with UV light in the context of full spectrum sunlight. If we look at the like harms, quote unquote, of UV light for the eyes, some of those initial studies were done with taking rodents, holding their eyelids open so they couldn't blink, and shining UV light, just plain UV light, not in full spectrum sunlight, into their eyes. And then they're like, oh, it caused eye damage. Well, it's like, this is not relevant to the real
No.
world at all. And same with like the, all the skin cancer studies. And we even have literature in the dermatology literature. If you actually look at it, and I have a carousel on my Instagram of about 15 different studies pulled from the dermatology research showing that actually more sun exposure is associated with lower risk of melanoma, that high vitamin D levels are protective against melanoma, and vitamin D is also stimulated in response to UVB light specifically in the same way that POMC is. And we also know that indoor workers have higher risk of melanoma than outdoor workers. And so these three pieces of evidence together, people go outside and they think they need to slap the sunscreen because they don't want to get melanoma. But it turns out that actually more UV light and more sunlight is protective against melanoma, not the opposite. And that in addition to that, we see full spectrum sun exposure. As you increase your dose of sun exposure, you get a decreased risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, multiple cancer types, including melanoma, but also breast cancer, prostate, blood cancers, colon cancer as well. Neurodegeneration is another one that's protected against in the context of more full spectrum sun exposure. And so basically, if we look at the risk benefit analysis of getting more sun, the balances are clearly weighed towards getting more sun is better for you, not less. And yet somehow we're myopically focusing on these reductionist UV light and isolation studies to tell people that they should never get full spectrum sun on their skin, that they should always block it out. And this is coupled with the problem that as we're stuck on screens more and more, myopia rates are rising. Nearsightedness is approaching 50% of the world population is projected to be myopic by the year 2050. And that means that a lot of people are walking around with contacts and glasses that block UV light. Or if they're not wearing those, they're wearing sunglasses because they think it's
Right.
good for them. And now suddenly we're not getting any of that UV light into the eyes that's required to stimulate these pathways that are signaling our fullness, our autonomy, heightened mood, heightened dopamine status, but also directly relating to the obesity crisis as well. So one of the other cleavage products of POMC is called alpha MSH, or melanocyte stimulating hormone. As the name implies, this factor stimulates the production of new melanin within melanocytes, which is what allows you to get a tan in response to UV light. But in addition to that, alpha MSH works in the hypothalamus to decrease appetite and increase energy expenditure. So simply by getting outside into that midday UVB light, we're naturally going to want to eat less, and our bodies are going to feel a sense of energy satiety, let's say. So that means that you can actually afford to burn more energy at rest through upregulation of your resting metabolic rate. And that means, that essentially boils down to the more UV light you get, the healthier your body composition can be. You can maintain it more easily. You can achieve body composition goals more easily. And it becomes no surprise when we look at the obesity epidemic as it relates to sun avoidance and sunscreen, sunglasses use, that these are all related to each
Yeah.
other.
One thing I wanted to put on the table too is years ago, I did quite a comprehensive course in nutrition with a guy named David Getoff, who has now passed away. But he showed studies, and I've tested this myself, and he showed that vitamin A, C, E, and selenium, if you have adequate amounts of them in the body, have a natural protective effect, and that it's actually better than sun creams, but you still actually interact with the sun, get the benefits of the sun, but you're not going to get nearly as burned by the sun. And I think because of people's diets being, I found research years ago that shocked me. They did large surveys and found that the average person only eats 10 to 12 different foods their whole lifetime, which is
Oh my
shocking,
God.
right? Really
Yeah.
dangerous, which is why in my holistic lifestyle training program, I show the rainbow and say, look, a simple way to make sure you're getting enough variety is just to eat foods from each of these colors. Just walk around, the farmer's market or whatever, and, notice that blueberries are blue and eggplant has a blue purple color to it and squash is yellow. And, it's just a simple way of thinking, okay, I got to get enough variety because that covers the vitamin, mineral, trace mineral, etc. spectrum. And I also think glutathione is really important for people today because it's so helpful with detoxifying the body and protecting the body from free radical damage and things like that. So I don't know if you have any thoughts in that regard.
I do. Yeah. So a lot of the way that people are living in the modern day is actually increasing your risk of burning in response to being in midday sun. So one of them circles back to the blue light exposure issue. Like we mentioned earlier, blue light will inhibit mitochondrial function on your surfaces, on your skin, eyes, and proximal brain regions. And that's a problem because the mitochondria in the skin are actually required to make new melanin to allow you to tan in response to that sun exposure. So if you're constantly irradiating yourself with artificial light that's enriched in blue, now your melanogenic response, that new melanin synthesis, is going to be impaired, and you're not going to be able to basically muster that same response that's going to allow you to then build your solar callus, so to speak, so that you can then absorb that photonic energy from the sun without becoming burned. Diet almost certainly plays a role as well. We need to do some research to prove this, but mechanistically, it makes perfect sense that if you're consuming a lot of omega 6 fats relative to omega 3, that you're going to be more prone to burning. As it is, all the industrially produced seed oils, they're coming to consumers highly rancid and
Yeah, they're
oxidized, and
poison.
that is creating, yeah, it's poison. It's creating a pro-inflammatory environment, which is then setting your skin up to be more prone to burning. It can also change skin cell membrane lipid composition because the skin turns over so quickly. The fats that you're eating in the diet are directly influencing the membrane composition of those skin cells. And so if you have too many of those PUFAs, those omega-6 PUFAs in particular, now we're changing basically the fluid dynamics of the cell membrane to make that cell membrane less robust against the environment compared to something like saturated fat, which, because there's no double bonds, they stack on each other really
Yeah.
nicely and they create a nice firm cell membrane that is able to be protected against damage from an excess of UV rays, let's
Those,
say, in somebody
those
else's
seed
pale
oils
skin.
make your cell membranes more like plastic and less like a breathing membrane. That's the way I
Yes,
would
exactly.
describe it, simply put.
Totally. It changes the fluid, like at a biophysical level, it changes the fluid dynamics, and that changes everything because the way that the cell is interfacing with the environment is informing how it's able to
It's
function.
also
Um,
hugely influential on the body's capacity to detox and take intracellular toxins, put them in the extracellular fluid to go through the detox pathways. And I think the more you do that to the cell, the less natural intelligence it has for exchange because you're replacing the molecules of your body with things that are unnatural to the body that have been largely cooked. Like those seed oils are often heat treated, and they're
oh
very
yeah.
toxic to the body. I if I, for example, eat some potato chips, even if they're organic and they've got any of those seed oils, within probably 4 hours, my skin starts breaking out. It's like my body absolutely despises that stuff.
Big time, and because they're full of polyunsaturated fats, the omega-6 fats, they are very fragile and prone to being oxidized, and that's what makes them particularly bad relative to something like, like products from Andreas seed oils, which are, like, cold pressed, they're processed in a very particular way, they're packaged in Myron glass, so they're not coming to you oxidized and rancid, they're actually nourishing and
Yeah.
supportive in that context, but for the industrially produced seed oils, they're absolute trash, they wreak havoc, and it's coupled with the fact that people are also under consuming omega-3 fats, in particular EPA and DHA, which are the animal-based omega-3s you get from things like, eating oysters, different shellfish, fatty fish, etc., assuming they're wild caught at least. These omega-3s actually have anti-inflammatory
Hmm.
effects, so the ratio needs to be correct. And today, the modern person is consuming about a 20 to 1 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. And in the ancestral landscape, it was something like 1 to 1 to 2
Yeah.
to 1 omega-6 to omega-3. So the ratio is completely skewed. And if we look at those pathways, actually, the way that the body deals with omega-6 linoleic acid and omega-3 alpha linoleic acid, which is the plant form of omega-3s, or EPA and DHA as well, which are the animal forms, they share the same enzyme machinery. So let's say you're not consuming any seafood, so you're not really getting any EPA or DHA. So you're relying on ALA to meet your omega needs. Even if you weren't consuming any, you know, omega-6 fats, you're only gonna maximally convert about 10% of that ALA into or EPA and about 5% or less into DHA. But when you add on to that issue omega-6 intake, now you're out competing that same enzymatic machinery for elongation. And that means you're going to convert even less to that really important DHA molecule, which is not only anti inflammatory, but it's also absolutely critical for the eyes and the brain. And the work of Dr. Crawford, who's like a biophysicist in the DHA research space, is very, very, very interesting. He basically shows that DHA is working at the quantum biologic level to convert photonic energy from light into electronic energy. And those impulses then allow your brain to render reality from moment to moment. So DHA is really working at this very fundamental level. And over 60% of the retina and the RHT that connects the retina to the brain is made of DHA. And the brain is like 35% DHA by weight. And so many people are getting no DHA in their diet. They're only getting some ALA, and most of that's not being converted because they're consuming way too much seed oils and omega 6s. And it's a recipe for disaster from eye health standpoint, brain health standpoint, and an inflammatory standpoint.
Yeah, and one of the problems, unfortunately, with fish being such a good source of these good oils is the oceans are becoming so terribly polluted. Like,
Yes.
unfortunately, I have quite a restricted diet for a variety of reasons, but my body's very, very sensitive, and I'm allergic to beef and dairy. So I have, there's not much I can eat. Um, and I can't eat more than 2 or 3 meals of fish, and I start feeling sick. And we get wild.
What about
Well,
shellfish?
I can do okay on shellfish, but it's just like there's now so much toxicity in the fish. I feel my body rejecting it. It's like I
Yeah.
get to the point like after 3 meals, like I literally feel like I might vomit. And I've found the
Mm.
bigger the fish, the worse it is. And so one of the things I highly recommend people do to get high quality oils and low bioaccumulation of toxins is to eat sardines because they're very high quality, and being small, they don't bioaccumulate so much. And Penny buys fresh sardines from the fishermen and cooks them, and they're just gorgeous. They taste good. They're my body really, and I think for people that need a fairly high amount of fat and protein in their diet, sardines have that dark meat like tuna does, which has higher in purines, which research shows helps make neurotransmitters. So I think what metabolic typing calls fast oxidizers, those people need more of the purines in their diet. And most of them turn out to be explosive athletes because I've tested this for years and years and years. And I found very few athletes that are in sports like Olympic lifting, weightlifting, powerlifting, martial arts, sprinting, gymnastics, tennis. Very few of those people as a whole, when I test them, don't turn out to be what metabolic typing calls fast oxidizers, what I call polar type, which is people that have gene lines that come from regions that freeze in the winter. And those are the people that do the worst if they take on a vegetarian diet because they cannot get the nutrients they need to run their body. And so it's death by ism. Before we
Yes.
move on, though, I would really love it if we loop back to the light pollution at night and talk about the effects on bees, insects, plants, and surrounding nature, because you can look at satellite pictures of the Earth at night. It fucking glows, man. It's like we don't have dark. You look at
Yes.
an area like Los Angeles at night or Chicago, and you're talking about massive, massive light pollution. And spiritually, I have a very strong relationship to the bees. The bees were my first power animal, and I have a very intimate, loving relationship with bees. And I communicate with these beings, and they told me that the light pollution is disrupting their circadian rhythms and that they can't rest. And that's why they keep
Oh.
moving out of hives, because people start colonies of bees and then they just disappear. And the bees told me we can't rest. It's like we are up all night long and it's burning us out. And we're desperate to find areas that's dark enough at night. And,
Mhm.
these are real things. So could you touch on that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So one thing I really want to emphasize here is just because we can't see it doesn't mean that light's not present. Like we mentioned earlier, there's a very small fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can actually see that's visible light. But we have all of our radio frequencies, whether it's from, antennas, radar, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, 5G, 4G, etc. Those are all forms of light as well. And so if it's dark outside and those frequencies are still around, it's not actually dark. So for these animals that can, I mean, we're also animals that can sense those frequencies, I would argue. We can't see them, but for animals that can see these frequencies and or sense them, they're never receiving that darkness in the evening that allows them to have healthy circadian rhythms. And it's also worth noting here as well that like people should be, if you can, turn your Wi-Fi off at night. Don't sleep with your devices around your bed. Curate a dark environment as possible. If you have street lights outside, try to get blue or like blackout curtains so that no light is coming through. You really want a dark environment that's dark not only from visible light but also non-visible light to the best of your ability.
I have a whole chapter,
And
by the way, on sleep and how to prepare your sleep environment, and check it in my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, for anyone that wants
beautiful.
support on that.
Yes, it's so important. And for people who work shift work or who can't go to sleep, rise and sleep with the sun, let's say, one thing that you should really at least try to dial in is your blue light
Mhm.
exposure. So, independent of sleep, darkness and bright light during the day are very important. So, even if you're not able to go to sleep, as early as you would like, wearing your blue blockers and preventing that blue light from coming into your eyes starting around sunset is really, really important to at least send the signal to your body that, there's no blue light present. It's dark. It's not going to be perfectly dark, of course, because you're still going to be operating somewhere with light to use the glasses, but at least that signal of blue is gone. So that's allowing your body to relax a bit, to become less cortisol dominant and have that melatonin to rise up. And that helps to engage the processes in the system that are associated with the evening, which include things like cellular turnover, regeneration, repair, autophagy, things like this that are required in the darkness, but if we're never getting that darkness, we don't engage those processes appropriately. So we need to make sure we're curating the right environments for ourselves in during the day and in the evening. And if you're doing that, even if you're shorting yourself on sleep, you're going to receive benefits from it by simply eliminating the blue light from the environment starting when the sun goes
Mm.
down. And it's the same for, for all the critters outside too. And I wish that we could just get some policy change and get all of our streetlights turned to amber or red. Like, I think it would be a simple
Yeah.
solution that would dramatically reduce light pollution, but we got some work to do.
Yeah, the problem, Alexis, as you know, is like the number of compounding factors, any one of which is seriously threatening, has now reached a list of, it would be pages long, from water pollution to air pollution to electromagnetic pollution to soil pollution to uh, toxicity and medical drugs to uh, mind manipulation with fifth generation warfare and phones. And I'm like, when you start looking at 5G and all, like it can be fucking overwhelming. I mean, I've been talking about these things and teaching soil science for 40 fucking years. And, my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, came out in 2004. I got all this stuff in there that people are now just beginning to think is cool new stuff. And I'm like, I was lecturing on this before you were fucking born. But the point I'm making is that it's sad because I go around the world and it's almost like I was never here. It's like, oh my God, I've tried so hard. We've probably sold 250,000 copies of How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy. And it's like the the magnitude of the disinformation, confusion, and manipulation and destruction of the environment and humanity and the food supply is happening at a rate that is so fast, it would take 1,000 of me and you having kids every 10 minutes and educating them, go out and be teachers to begin to confront it, which is one of the main reasons I do my podcast. Because I say all the time, look, it's an all hands on deck situation. And so if you want to be an expert in light, teach light. If you want to be an expert in food, teach food. But we need everybody to find their dream in their heart. And whatever it is they can do to contribute, it's time to get out and share your love, because I don't want to be a fatalist, but I'm a realist. If you start adding up all these, all you got to do is, here's an analogy I give my patients about their lives after doing an assessment on them. I say, look, if you get bit by one mosquito, it's no big deal. But if 500 bite you at once, you're probably going to get malaria. And it's a metaphor. And when I look at my patients, some of which think they're very holistic, they're personal trainers and healthcare professionals, and I look at the way they eat and the way they live, and it's all magazine health, sports bars, canned drinks and packaged vitamins, and they're not even close to living a healthy life. So the number of negative inputs that are stressing the body, you take, okay, this is worth a point, that's worth a point. Well, the next thing you know, you don't have enough anabolic power to deal with the catabolic stress. Anabolic, for those of you that don't know, tissue regenerative, catabolic, tissue destructive, or catabolic yang, energy and resource consumptive, yin, energy and resource accumulative. So we're outgassing far more energy, resources, and life force than we can recover. And this is why all the circadian stuff is so important, because there's nothing more anabolic than quality sleep. That's been the doctor's best medicine for thousands of years. But the number of people that come to me that can't sleep is through the roof.
If you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you've probably heard Paul raving about one of his absolute go-to supplements, P3OM from Bioptimizers. Well, they've given it a new name, Probiotic Breakthrough. It's the same amazing formulation, just with a new name. Here's a chat that Paul and Wayne had about Probiotic Breakthrough before it changed its name.
Bioptimizers makes an amazing product called P3OM, which is a prebiotic product. And it's amazing for not only helping repopulate the gut with friendly bacteria, but as Wade will tell you, it's really, really an amazing product in case you ever feel like you're getting any kind of food poisoning or illness coming on. And Wade's right here with me, and he's the co-founder of Bioptimizers, and he knows more about P3OM than anybody. But I can tell you this, I've had nothing but excellent results and nothing but positive feedback from all my clients and friends that I've turned on to P3OM. So Wade, tell us a little bit about P3OM and why it works so well.
Well, P3M is, we call it the Navy SEAL of probiotics.
Amen.
Basically, its job is to kick out the bad guys in your body. Food poisoning is one of those things from bad bacteria. What we've done is we've taken an aggressive strain of L. plantarum. We put it into toxic soup, ran a sine wave to keep a few of them alive. And the few survivors we grow in very specialized medium to make a cultured, patented enzyme that has extraordinary powers. Number one, it survives the intestinal tract.
Yes.
And number two, it absolutely hunts down pathogens in the body, bacteria, viruses, these type of things. And this is really where the future of probiotics is. It is about developing and culturing and creating super strains of probiotic, very much like the Navy SEALs goes through a training, and these individuals have extraordinary powers to deal with chaos. And in today's world where we want to improve our immunity and our function and our gut health, P3OM is head and shoulders above any probiotic out there.
So my understanding is it can be used daily as a supplement, but it can also be used in larger quantities as a defense measure.
We've tested this literally with over 100 of our friends who have been suffering from various times of food poisoning. And a handful of those guys, when you're in food poisoning, and within 20 to 30 minutes, you complete recovery.
That's awesome. And I've seen it happen myself. Angie has felt bad a number of times, and several of people in the house or family have. And I say, take 10. If that doesn't feel good in an hour, take 20. And you've told me you can't overdose on them, which is amazing.
Yeah, that's the beauty of P3OM. You can't take too much. They'll fight off the bad guys, and they'll get your digestion rocking and rolling the way it should.
So if you want to have a healthy gut and you want some defense, carry P3OM with you wherever you go, airplanes, cars, business meetings, hotels, conferences, and you've got your Navy SEALs in the bottle. and they're ready for you anytime. Wade, how do we get a hold of your amazing P3OM product?
Super easy. Just go to www.bioptimizers.com/living4D and put in Paul10 for your 10% discount code. That's bioptimizers.com/living4D and Paul10 for your discount code.
You got it. There you go. Try it. You'll love it. I use them. I can't tell you enough how much I love this product. I think it's a genius product, and you've heard it right from the master himself. Get your P3OM. Let us know how you feel about it. Lots of love.
Totally. And whenever I see people, like you mentioned earlier, when you were coming up to your midlife crisis and you were waking up in the middle of the night, like wired and awake, and it's so common, and it's pretty frequently seen that we see like a cortisol rise early, especially if you're engaging in a lot of tech use in the evening, and you're exposing yourself to a lot of light before bedtime, whether it's watching TV before bed or maybe even sleeping with the TV on. If that cortisol starts rising early, it's kicking on the sympathetic response, and it's trying to get you up and going, even if it's not the right time to do that. But circling back to what you just said briefly, I think I'm a little bit hopeful since COVID. Like, people seem to be waking up at more increasing rates,
Yeah,
let's
they are
say,
for
and
sure. It's
yeah,
lovely.
and so
It's lovely.
when I when I started talking about this, when I fell down the rabbit hole on this stuff in April of 2023, it's almost been 2 years. It's been like warp speed, and like people are really interested in this topic and to learn more. And I honestly barely get any pushback from anybody. Everybody just seems to resonate. It's like, oh, this makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. This is just, we're getting back into nature. We're just trying to get into rhythm with the sun and with natural light and dark cycles, and eating seasonally. And we can talk about the benefits of that, like mechanistically, but just logically, it makes sense to eat in alignment with your environment so that your body is able to be adapted to that environment. Getting cold when it's cold out, getting hot when it's hot out, sweating, moving your body, like just all these very basic things that people can get access to for mostly free. It doesn't require an expensive pill or potion. It's really just getting back to
Well,
basics.
people forget we are the environment. I mean, we're turning
Exactly.
over 2 million red blood cells a second. Your epidermis turns over about every 3 days. Your bone cells turn over, I think it's every 6 weeks approximately. You turn over every single cell in your body based on current science every 365 days. So you're actually like a waterfall. I mean, a fountain. I'm sure you've seen big fountains in parks. And when you're far enough away, it looks like an ice sculpture. You don't realize it's water moving, but as you approach it,
Yeah.
you see it's actually flowing. So the human body is like it's like a hologram that is a living structure, but it's replacing it based on what you eat and drink and breathe and the light that you're engaging. And if we don't give it what it needs, then the capacity for us to maintain the structure that makes Alexis recognizable as Alexis starts to break down, right? If the next time I saw you, you were 100 pounds bigger and had pimples all over your face, I might not know who you were, right? So the point I'm making, and this is, in my holistic lifestyle coaching program, I teach a concept called the echo. And the echo is to describe how we interact with our environment. In our environment, we have energy, chemistry, hydration, and organisms. And whatever we do to the chemistry in the environment, we do to ourselves. Whatever we do to the energy in the environment, such as electromagnetic radiation and all the things we're talking about, we do it to ourselves. Whatever we do to the capacity to hydrate ourselves and poison the water or lack water, we do to ourselves. And whatever we do to the organisms in the environment, we do it ourselves, because everything that we're replacing is coming from out there. And then our waste goes out into the environment. And here's an interesting little factoid for you. Having studied the history of soil science, in China and in native cultures, they often collected all their poop. It was called
Midnight
right.
soil.
But
Yes.
now the top soil scientists in the world say don't ever put your poop in your garden because it's so toxic it can kill the microorganism in the soil. So we have actually gotten to the point where we are a threat to nature. And this is why we have got to support biodynamic and organic and free range farmers, because they're the only ones regenerating and nourishing and healing and growing our topsoil base, which is the basis of health. So like I really love our dialogue here because it's really bringing it full spectrum. It's not just light alone. It's not food alone. You can become a food fanatic. You can become an exercise fanatic. But you know, are you familiar with my 4-doctor system? So
I
you
am.
can't be a 3-doctor person and be healthy. So we
Yes.
can't be a light expert and expect to be healthy, because I work with sick experts all the time.
Totally.
We've got to look at this. And here's the paradox. If you study quantum physics, it's all made of light. Everything. All
Exactly.
atoms
Yes.
are light moving at just under the speed of light in an entangled relationship. So, all the food, everything we're talking about is actually a discussion about light.
It is. And I really like the definition of food. We can think about food as being a barcode for the light
Yeah.
environment in which it was grown, assuming it was grown and not made in a lab, which I would argue anything made in a lab is not food. It's not really
Well,
food.
just to touch
Um,
on that, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I've tested this, and I'm very, very sensitive because I do subtle energy work and work with people's energy fields and stuff. And through all my years of Tai Chi and Qigong, I've tuned myself very well. I can literally feel the electricity flowing through even a small wire, right through the energy, through the coding. But quantum physics and physics, they basically conclude that everything in the created universe is energy, information, and frequency. And so if the
yeah.
food's not healthy, it's not the right frequency and it's not the right information. If you're eating genetically modified food, you're bringing something into your body it doesn't have a clue what to do with. And I could go on an
100%.
hour conversation, but we have to realize that the energy, information, and frequency spectrum that we are designed to interface, which is why my echo concept is so important, is that of nature itself. And we're imposing all these external, not native, foreign energies, informations, and frequencies. And if you want to know how powerful frequency, and just study homeopathy, right?
Yes.
There's your answer. So I guess my only point that I'm trying to elaborate is everything we're talking about, including the light, has to be incorporated in your life with a level of consciousness that's adequate to keep you healthy. And you must be aware that today it's more important than ever to do these things, because the number of negative inputs that we have to deal with and defend ourselves against is the highest it's ever been. And our government agencies are pumping this shit at us like there's no tomorrow. And if you study food science, they've been extracting nutrition and ruining food since the Second World War. I mean, so we've got to really get together and protect the real scientists and protect the real farmers and fund them and support them. And thank God for people like you that are giving us enough knowledge to wake up and say, oh my God, I know I really need to get blue blockers. I said to you, I need to get better lights in my house because I want the support of the light. I don't want to have to use biogeometry to defend me against my light bulbs. I've been meaning to do it for a long time, but I've just been so goddamn busy. I'm like, okay, I got to do this. And I keep looking at them, but you're my trigger, and I wrote it down. And by the next time I see you, I'll have new lights in here.
Yay, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, oh my gosh, there's so much I could mention. Just briefly, you mentioned about homeopathy and subtle frequencies having a major impact on the body. This is also what Robert O. Becker found, the author of The Body Electric. He found this in his research that very small frequencies were able to magnify within biological systems and have very meaningful
Mm-hmm.
outcomes. And that's what he found with bone regeneration. So a lot of people don't know that bone doesn't actually heal, it regenerates
Mm-hmm.
completely. And so when bone regenerates, it basically is taking a very small subtle frequency that is propagating through the semiconductor matrix of the tissue that is facilitating that regeneration process. And so it should make perfect sense then that other very subtle energies can also have major impact on our biology. I also wanted to circle back. You were talking about metabolic typing and how I want to talk about how this relates to mitochondrial health and mitochondrial haplotypes as well. So there are two primary classes of mitochondria that people can have. It's kind of more of a spectrum, but just broadly, we have uncoupled mitochondria and coupled. The terms coupled and uncoupled come from that electron transport chain that we talked about earlier. So the closer those protein complexes are to each other, the more coupled they are, the more coupled the flow of electrons is to the production of energy. And so the coupled mitochondria, they're the most ancestral type. They come from the cradle of humanity in West Africa. The L0 haplotype is the oldest mitochondrial haplotype known. It's extremely coupled. And it's the same reason why, marathon runners from Kenya just absolutely kick ass because their mitochondria are so efficient at making energy they can, just outrun anybody else. And that comes from the fact that they live in a very high UV light environment. Not only is it equatorial, but it's also at a high altitude. And the higher up you go in altitude, the more UV light you have available from the sun. And the closer you are to the equator, the more UV light you receive year round. So these are the really coupled mitochondria. They live in more equatorial regions. They are able to subsist on more carbohydrate containing foods year round because that's naturally growing in their
Mm-hmm.
environments. And as it turns out, this also links back to the deuterium story that I alluded to earlier. Deuterium is a heavier form of hydrogen. It's not radioactive. Tritium is the radioactive hydrogen, but deuterium has one neutron. Light hydrogen, protium, has no neutrons, just a proton and an electron. So deuterium has this extra neutron. And because of that, deuterium is bigger in size. And we talked about earlier the electron transport chain and separating positive from negative charge, electrons from protons. The mitochondria are extremely racist against deuterium. They do not want deuterium in there because, as it turns out, when you go to dissipate the gradient that's formed with the protons to bring them back into the inner matrix that facilitates the production of ATP, deuterium doesn't really fit through the pore very well. And so it gets stuck there. It can gunk up the engines and it can cause the mitochondria to break down. And so when you're somewhere more equatorial and you're eating more roots and fruits, let's say more carbohydrate containing foods, there's much more deuterium in those foods. But because you're in a more warmer climate with higher UV light, your body's actually able to detox that deuterium more readily. Sweating is a major route of detox for deuterium. Urination is another one. We also think that UV light exposure onto the skin, which can facilitate what's called human photosynthesis, whereby melanin, instead of chlorophyll in plants, works on the light to split water. In humans, there's research suggesting that melanin can serve a similar function, that it can basically separate water into free electrons, protons, and oxygen, thereby creating free energy. But it can also reform the water. So melanin is just super interesting. It's also a major detoxification molecule. It can pull out heavy metals from the bloodstream. And so getting a tan is like incredible for you from a detoxification standpoint, also from a human photosynthetic standpoint. But that melanin can also reform water, and in doing so, it can remove deuterium from that water because it only reforms water with the light hydrogen. And so, if you live somewhere equatorial, you can handle more deuterium in your foods because your environment is equipping your system to be able to deal with it. Compared to somebody who lives, let's say they have a very uncoupled mitochondrial haplotype from Scandinavia. So my haplotype is H2, it's Scandinavian. I have basically Vikings from my mom's side, and my dad's side is West African primarily. So I'm mixed. But my mitochondria, because all mitochondria come from mom, my mitochondria come from Scandinavia. And so what that means is I have a very uncoupled mitochondrial haplotype that has uncoupled the flow of electrons from the production of energy. And in doing so, it allows the mitochondria to release more heat, more light into the environment. More infrared and UV light is released from my mitochondria, especially in response to cold. So, cold is a really strong stimulator of mitochondrial metabolism. And whenever you stimulate mitochondrial metabolism, because that process is the process by which light is made, you get cold, you stimulate light production. So it's actually a perfect system when you think about it, because in the wintertime, let's say in Norway in the wintertime, when sun is very scarce and there's no UV light, the cold actually allows your body to become its own sun. It's compensating for the lack of infrared and UV light from the sun by producing its own in response to cold. And so the uncoupled mitochondria are really good at doing that, but they don't do as well with higher deuterium loads in the diet. And that's why, like you were alluding to, when the ground freezes, you don't really have plant food options, relying more on protein and fat as your primary energy sources. And your mitochondria, if they're uncoupled, do really well with eating a higher fat and protein diet because now they're able to actually make more of that light and heat that they need in order to survive the winter, essentially. And then, of course, if it's summertime and there's plant foods available, then you can eat them because it's a warmer temperature, you can sweat more, you can process that deuterium more. So the seasonal eating and like the mitochondrial haplotypes and the links to metabolic typing and eating a metabolically appropriate diet, I think is just super
It's
interesting.
amazing stuff. You're doing two things for me right now, Alexis. One, you're giving me new ways of understanding light and a lot of the stuff. I've listened to Jack Kruse talk about this, but I find you easier to digest. I don't know why, but maybe it's just your delivery. I can actually process what you're saying better. Just like it's easier to read Marie Louise von Franz talk about Carl Jung's work than it is to read his own work, or some Steiner initiates explain Steiner better than Steiner does. It's not unusual for geniuses to be so genius they have a hard time stepping it down.
Totally.
But you're also validating everything I've been teaching for my whole career because it's based on the principles of nature. I remember the first
Yes.
time I did a podcast with Ben Greenfield, he said to me, Paul, one of the criticisms I get about your book is that it's outdated. And I said,
Please.
Ben, I handed him the book and I said, I challenge you to find one thing in this book that's outdated. If you do, I'll kiss your ass on the highest table in the busiest restaurant in town. I can't remember if I told him that on or off the recording, but I said, that's ridiculous because this is all based on foundation principles. There's no way you can escape the reality of nutrition, hydration, sleep, breathing, thinking, and movement. So if you can tell me when any of those is outdated, I'll be very interested to know, because at that time there will be no human beings on the planet.
My gosh, that's hysterical. Yeah, none of these things will ever go out of style, you know? And these are the things that people aren't getting, that they aren't doing. Everybody wants a quick fix, a
Yeah.
pill, a potion that's going to solve
That's
their
why I
problems.
fucking hate the concept of biohacking. I say,
Agreed. I love your term
amen.
bioharmonizing. I use it all the time.
One of the things that we didn't get a chance to talk about that I left in the notes that I wanted to share with you, because I think it's very important to this discussion, is biological oscillators. Are you familiar with biological oscillators?
Well, if I'm understanding it correctly, I mean, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is a biological oscillator in that it creates a pulse signal from the light environment. It's interpreting that, and then that signal is sent to the rest of the body to inform the other clocks within the other tissues what time of day it is.
Well,
Is that
yeah, I'm
similar
talking
concept?
about it from a different perspective. I'm talking about the electromagnetic pulse wave. And so the three
Okay.
primary biological oscillators that HeartMath speaks about in their research is the brain, the heart, and the gut system. The brain's
Got it.
electromagnetic field is 5,000 times stronger than the brain. So the heart's the chief biological oscillator, which is rhythm manager.
Yes.
And so in my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, have you seen my zone exercises? So those are designed to harmonize the biological oscillators. That's what Tai Chi and Qigong do. Anytime you have rhythmic breathing at a lower level of intensity that it takes to do the exercise. So a work in exercise, by definition, is an exercise that produces more energy than it costs to do it. So you end up with a surplus, which is why your heart rate should never speed up, your breathing rate should never speed up, your tongue should never dry out, and you should be comfortable doing it on a full stomach. Those are the criteria. So the thing I wanted to bring up is that when your circadian rhythms are out of balance, you're almost always going to suffer the disharmony of your biological oscillators, which is like an engine that's so out of tune, your car just shakes and it burns extra fuel, things break, things just don't work well. So anybody that's having any of the kinds of things that we're talking about can do the zone exercises in my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy. And by doing rhythmic breathing and gentle movement, you bring your brain waves, your heart pulse, and your peristalsis into a mathematical relationship with each other. HeartMath found, for example, if you take someone's heart rate and divide it by their breathing rate, if you get a fractionated number, it means the system is out of balance. So
Very
if you get a whole number, like if your heart rate is 60 and you're breathing, just for mathematical sake, 5 times a minute, which, in a relaxed state isn't that unusual, you'll get an unfractionated number. So I spent years using various techniques, from biofeedback to heart rates, heart mass freeze framer, and doing things on checking people's parasympathetic nervous system activation. I have all my patients, I teach them how to check their morning heart rate. After 7 days, they do an average, and then they check their morning heart rate each week against the average. And I show if your heart rate rises 3 beats above your average, you're under too much stress. 4 beats, you need to not exercise. 5 beats, you're probably going to get sick. I found tracking this on spreadsheets for years that athletes would get sick within 72 hours quite consistently of their heart rate going 5 beats above average. And you re-average your heart rate every week so that you can see, because as the body gets fitter and the biological oscillators harmonize, the resting heart rate goes down. For example, when I was a competitive triathlete, my resting heart rate was 36, and they often made me get examined by the doctor 3 times because they were worried that that was too low. But fortunately, when I went to the USTS National Championships to represent the United States Army there, because I won the Army Triathlon and qualified, there was a doctor there that had been doing a lot of research on elite endurance athletes. And he said, actually, no, I found lots of them at 36 because they weren't going to let me race. And if it wasn't for that doctor, I wouldn't have been able to race. The key point, though, is that harmonizing our biological oscillators not only accumulates life force energy, which helps us run all of our biological systems, but it makes the body more coherent and more stable so that it can handle more stress. And that includes circadian stress. And the other thing you can do is do these exercises first thing in the first hour of sunlight or the last hour of sunlight, so you're getting all the benefits of the sunlight that you can't handle. For example, you can look right at the sun, but there's a light called X-factor light. Are you familiar with X-factor light? Well, they talk about it in farming circles. Weston A. Price noticed that the grass grew very, very fast at certain times, and that farmers found that there's what they call X-factor butter, but this X-factor light, which X-factor, because I'm not really sure what it is. I don't know if they figured it out, but they found that there's this X-factor in light that makes the grass not only grow faster, but be more nutritious. And it shows up as higher density of nutrition in the butter and in the milk of cows. So you can actually search for X-factor butter, and some, like organic farms, will sell it because they know when that's happening. But the point is having done Egyptian sun gazing as a practice for a long time in my life, I did a year of it every day, morning and night. But I've seen researchers talk about the X-factor light, and you can get it because you can look directly at the sunlight, first hour and last hour of sunlight. So you can absorb all this X-factor light. And if you do your zone exercise at that time, you're not only harmonizing your biological oscillators, but you're actually harmonizing your circadian rhythms, which is why I tell people, if you're traveling to different time zones, get up with the sun and try to spend time in the sunlight for the first hour and the last hour, and it'll reset your biological clocks. And many people have found that extremely helpful. You know you're in big trouble when you do all these things that I know and you're still feeling like shit. That's how I knew I had to stop traveling, or I was gonna lose it. I was just gonna break down.
100%. That morning light you mentioned, there's another piece I wanted to make sure that I remembered to bring up, and that is the UVA rise. So when you go out in the morning for sunrise, if you get that My Circadian app, it will tell you when sunrise is, and it will tell you when UVA rise is. So UVA rise is when the UVA light starts to come into the spectrum. Because UV light is shorter wavelength, it can't penetrate as well through the atmosphere, so the sun needs to come up at a higher angle before it can penetrate through. So UVA rise is when that UVA light comes into the spectrum, and UVA light is really, really important. It's a major stimulator of nitric oxide production, which is responsible for vasodilation. As it turns out, it requires skin exposure for that to happen. So the more skin you have exposed, the more nitric oxide you can make, which facilitates nutrient and oxygen delivery to tissues and waste removal from tissues. I mentioned earlier that there's this light receptor called neuropsin on the skin and eyes as well that's looking for UVA light in the environment. And so that's important from a local circadian perspective. So in the skin and the eyes, that UVA light is helping to anchor the clocks in those tissues to the natural light environment. And so for the ideal morning routine would be to stay out, get out for sunrise, and stay out for, depends how what you've got going on. If you're super sick, the more time the better, but even just 5 to 15 minutes of sunrise light and then come out again for UVA rise and stay out for another 10 to 15 minutes is the best way to anchor in your circadian rhythm and anchor in your hormonal rhythms, optimize the cortisol response, optimize your cognition and metabolic processes. Getting that sunrise light is extremely important for optimizing beta oxidation, fat metabolism, essentially in mitochondria throughout the body. And so that sunrise to UVA rise time period is a really
And what's
special
the
time period for
UVA time
today.
period? Where's the UVA?
So it depends where you are. So right now for me, UVA rise is like an hour and a half after
Okay.
sunrise. But as you approach the summer solstice, it gets closer together. So it may only be 30 minutes after
Mhm.
sunrise on the
Can you
solstice.
feel what's happening as it's coming up? How would you describe it? Because, I'm healthy enough, and a lot of people might be healthy enough just to feel it.
You can, yeah. So actually, I had the pleasure of visiting El Salvador over Thanksgiving, and the sun rises really fast there because it's 13 north latitude. And so I'm standing out there watching the sunrise, and suddenly you just feel like there's a little extra spice or a little extra kick
Mhm.
to the sun. That's that higher energy waveform from the UV light coming into the spectrum, and it is palpable. Like it was extremely noticeable. I had never been out of the country before, so I never had the opportunity to experience more equatorial
Mm.
sun, and it was like you can radically feel the difference from, just this very warm kind of nurturing maternal type of energy from the sunrise. And then as that UVA rise kicks in, it's just a bit of a yang spice coming
Mhm.
into the
A
spectrum.
question I have for you that I'd like to hear your response to, just to ask it while it's on my mind. In Australia and New Zealand, but particularly Australia, the burn time is only about 4 minutes because of the depletion of the ozone layer. So a lot of people that I've talked to or that have been in my lectures and heard me talking about similar concepts have said, well, you can't really apply that here because the sun's so intense. So, what are your thoughts on how that relates to everything you're talking about with the sun and the nutrition? Because there's a high rate of skin cancer from sun exposure in Australia and New Zealand due to the depletion of the ozone layer. So how do you factor that into all of your concepts and discussion?
Yeah, so I know there were chemicals we were using in the 80s, I believe, that depleted ozone to a very high extent. Maybe they were in
Spray
like
cans.
uh yeah, the
Mhm.
spray cans, the air
Yeah,
conditioners as well. Maybe they were called
yeah,
CFCs or
yeah.
something like this.
Carboflora. Yeah,
Fluorofluorocarbons.
fluorocarbons.
Yeah, exactly. So, from my understanding, the ozone layer has actually done a decent recovery since we've removed those chemicals, and there is a donut hole over Antarctica. I think the main problem in Australia is that a bunch of Northern Europeans went down and
Yep.
colonized this land that they were not
True.
adapting to. And so, if you look at the Aboriginals, they have very dark skin. They're well
Very dark.
equipped to live there. Exactly. So, if you're somebody who lives in Australia that, has Northern European descent, you just need to gradually build up that solar callus, gradually build up that base tan so that you're able to tolerate more and more sun and leverage nature's sunscreen, which is the shade.
Mm,
When you sit in the shade, if you're around a bunch of green plants, you're actually still receiving a ton of light. So green plants reflect a ton of near
mm,
infrared light. And anytime you go outside during the day, as long as the sun is up, there is an abundance of near infrared light. It is completely ubiquitous, even on cloudy days, even if it's the middle of the winter, it's there. And that's one of the major inputs that's missing from our indoor environments is that near infrared light that directly stimulates and nourishes the mitochondria and supports metabolic water and energy production. And we're not getting that as modern humans indoors. So it's really important to have access to that because, like we mentioned earlier, if your mitochondria are working well, you can make melanin more easily as well. You're going to be less likely to burn. You're going to be getting a tan more easily. There's also a circadian link here. So if you're somebody prone to burning, living somewhere with intense sun, you want to make sure that you stop eating when the sun goes down and it's at least around 4 hours before you go to bed. Because as it turns out, if you eat too late, that's also disruptive to the circadian
yeah.
rhythm. And when you eat at night, we have actually literature showing now that eating at night increases your risk of getting a sunburn the next day or on subsequent days because those skin clocks are now out of sync. They're not expecting to receive light at the right times of day because they're not getting that darkness and that lack of food that's associated with the evening time that helps those clocks to work more efficiently. There's also one other thing I wanted to make sure that I mentioned because we talked about microbes and the microbiome is that UVB light, we talked about the benefits for vitamin D and POM C, but UVB light is also known to stimulate a skin gut axis, whereby just exposing yourself to UVB light increases gut microbiome diversity and function. And the research about this was actually really interesting. It was initially found in a tribe within the Amazon, the Yanomami tribe, and they found a special group of microbes in their gut that was very unique. And at first they thought it was because of their environment, but then they actually ended up doing some research here in the States and showing, oh, actually, if you're exposed to full spectrum sunlight, you can naturally build up the diversity of the specific group of microbes simply by getting that activation of the skin gut axis. And now we're also beginning to learn that all of our barriers are linked to each other. The skin, the gut, and the
Mm-hmm.
lungs, they're all very intricately regulated and all communicating with each other at all times. So when something is off in one of them, we often see something off in the rest. So, like gut issues associated with breathing or
Mm-hmm.
respiratory issues, skin infections, or asthma being associated with gut distress and skin issues, like they all tend to go together. And we also tend to see them all in like people who weren't breastfed as children. We tend to see lung, gut, and skin issues are really common. And it's all rooted in that microbial health that is being directly influenced by the light
Well, there's
environment.
something else. I don't know if you know this. I suspect you might. But did you know that embryologically your skin grows out of brain tissue?
Yes,
You are
neuroectoderm.
actually wearing your brain on your body, it's
Yeah,
your skin. And the brain has no
yeah.
sensory receptors. Once you open the skull, you could scoop someone's brain out and eat it right in front of them. They wouldn't feel a damn thing. So our skin is actually our brain experiencing our environment and reading it, and that a lot of people don't realize that how important that realization is.
Yeah, and it should make sense then how our skin is also sensing light and interpreting those signals in the same way that our
Yeah.
eyes and our brain, which our eyes are part of our brain, they're just outside of the
Yeah.
skull, are also doing that. It's really interesting. It also actually ties back to the melanin story as well because the melanocytes, they maintain their ability to undergo diapedesis, or like in terms of cancer we would call it metastasis. The melanocytes are able to move in the same way that our immune cells are able to move throughout the body. Melanocytes can also do the same thing. And so we're beginning to get some insights, and I want to do more research in this area, that if we cultivate melanin on our surface, like let's say we get a tan, if we need that melanin inside for, let's say, buffering reactive oxygen species production, because melanin is extremely potent antioxidant, and if there's reactive species or oxidative stress in a part of the body, like in the brain, let's say, melanin can be there as a buffer against that to prevent tissue
Mm.
damage. And that's also why we see melanin is depleted in Parkinson's disease and the substantia nigra, and it's a primary defect of Parkinson's disease. And of course, we've already kind of elucidated the tie between UV light exposure and melanin production. It's absolutely essential. Um, but anyways, that if we're cultivating that melanin on our skin, that if we need it internally, our body's actually able to pull that melanin inside and use it to protect our
So it's
internal
like a
organs.
bank.
And a lot Yeah, it's like a bank, and a lot of people will report if they go on a long plane flight that if they had a tan going into the flight, that their tan actually is reduced by the time they get off
That's
the plane.
interesting.
Yeah, and it's probably because you're in a very reactive environment when you go up, that high up into the atmosphere, and all the Wi-Fi and everything that's in planes on top of that is just wreaking havoc from an oxidative stress
Maybe that's what
perspective.
happened to Michael Jackson.
Well,
I'm
yeah, I
just
mean,
kidding, but
melasma and vitiligo, those are issues of
yeah.
melanocytes, and I mean, Jack talks about this as basically if you have vitiligo, it's your body pulling melanin from your surface because it needs it inside. It's essentially a sign that there's a lot of oxidative stress going on throughout the body that needs to be resolved by optimizing the environmental inputs and the diet and movement and everything else. Um, and one other thing that I'll mention on this front as well is cold, in addition to stimulating mitochondrial light production specifically, the light that it's producing, it includes that UVC light that we talked about earlier that's stronger than the sun, which is also able to produce new melanin inside of our organs and
Mhm.
tissues. So if we're leveraging cold, especially for people with Parkinson's disease, I have an uncle that has Parkinson's, so the protocol we're using for him is maxing on, UV light externally and internally. So getting cold, especially like coming up in the summer, if you can do cold plunging while getting full spectrum sun, and then maybe or doing cold plunge and then going out and getting your midday sun
Mhm.
afterwards, is going to be magical for helping to build the melanin both on you and also inside of you. And again, that's a primary defect in Parkinson's, is that loss of melanin that's buffering against reactive stress in those dopamine producing neurons. And so if we can help to reproduce that melanin, it can actually begin to reverse the etiology of the disease.
Yes. We've been going for almost 3 hours, and one of the things that I really got horny about in your outline is the spiritual aspects of light. Have you covered enough to feel good about maybe closing the podcast out with some of the spiritual stuff? Because you're one of the few people that actually talks about the spiritual aspects of light. Many of the things that you have in there, I actually talk about in Spirit Gym.
I love that.
I've got some things in Spirit Gym that I think will blow your mind. I'll have to direct you to a few key areas, but I'd love to kind of wrap it up with the spiritual aspects, and I will throw something spiritual on the table for you and everybody else to ponder. Photons are massless particles. So if you want to know how magical source is, and unconditional love can only be symbolized with 0, because any other number is a condition. So by definition, if God is unconditional love, God is a 0, which would be a massless particle, a massless something. So the mystery of light is that we have something that has no mass, yet creates matter and form. So I will open the door to your spiritual discussion with that paradox.
I love that. That's definitely a little bit of a paradox brain scratcher that I'm going to meditate on. I think it's just so fascinating. I mean, if we think about light, you can't perceive anything without it, right? So like we're very limited. Our sensory apparatus were developed really for reproduction and survival, and not for seeing what the truth of anything is, like in its essence. And that's, I think, why if we're using different psychedelic medicines, that it opens the windows of that perception so that we're able to perceive more of the data that's always there. But it's just allowing that window to open up a bit. We of course also alluded to, I don't know, remember if we were recording at the time, but a lot of those psychedelic medicines have ring structures in them that absorb UV light. So if you charge them up with full spectrum sunlight, or using something like a charged up Vogel crystal, which I want to talk about now for a little bit, it could be a really good way to improve the potency and the spiritual aspects of those types of ceremonies. But something I want to study in the light lab is Vogel crystals. And so Marcel Vogel, I think I alluded to him early in this conversation. He worked for IBM for like 30 years almost. He developed LCD screen technologies. And after he retired, he devoted his life to studying crystals. And he found that if you cut quartz, which is silicon dioxide, but it's a very special structure of it, and if you get a good clarity quartz that's colorless and clear, and cut it to specific angles. So if you look at a Vogel crystal, it like comes to a point on both ends. I have one as well, but I don't have it on me, so I can't show the audience. But anyway, if you look it up, vogelcutcrystals.com, I think Russ cuts them. That's where I got mine. It's very, very
I got
good.
mine from, I've had him on my podcast. His dad was a famous inventor with like 900 patents. Ross Newkirk.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
he custom cuts Vogel cut crystals. His father was friends with Marcel Vogel. Since we're talking about
Yeah.
Marcel Vogel, I wonder if you know about this thing that Marcel Vogel did. Did you know that he made what looks like an iPad out of crystal, and he could put his hands on it and project his thoughts into it, and the images would come up just like a television, and no one's ever been able to reproduce it.
Whoa.
Yeah, he would just
That's
put it looked just like an iPad, a flat sheet of crystal that he custom cut, and he would just direct his thoughts into it, and you would see his thoughts just like a television image, just like you see on a computer screen.
Yeah, I'm still doing my deep dives. I'm taking a class right now with Robert Gilbert on like how to work with gems and crystals, and there's a whole section on Vogel crystals, which I haven't gotten to yet. But part of the research I want to do in the future light lab is working with Vogel crystals, because essentially to distill part of Vogel's findings, he found that if you cut the crystals to specific angles and you have a really good clarity colorless quartz crystal, that you can charge it up with your hand and with intention. And then if you vortex water around the crystal, you can make UV light in the water. So I mean, from a sanitation standpoint, obviously, but we think from a structural standpoint, it's even more important from creating the proper water structure that's actually providing your body with the information it needs to
Mm-hmm.
thrive. And of course, we already elucidated all the benefits of UV light throughout the conversation. So, something that I think quite a lot about is, a lot of people, if they want to heal a chronic disease, let's say, and they need to improve their light environment to do that, but maybe they can't afford to, move somewhere with better quality sun, for example, or, they're limited by their location. What if we can create a, crystalline technology that allows them to get access to UV light that they wouldn't have otherwise had through using something like a Vogel crystal technology, whether it's wearable, whether it's through their water. It could be an absolute game changer. I
You
mean,
might even be
just
able to
we
make
talk
light bulbs that have the
totally.
right structure out of crystal that literally shine specific frequencies into the environment that nourish the body. There's a guy that came to me, Alexis. I wish you were here. If I can find his business card, I got to connect him to you. He's a scientist. And one of my friends knew him and brought him to me and said, you got to meet Paul Chek, and I think he would love to see your invention. He created a plasma light that glows at the same intensity and luminosity of the sun. It was the size of a
What?
golf ball, and he lit it up in here. It's a box full of electronics, and it's got this little glass bulb, and it has plasma gas in it. And as that thing illuminated, it was so damn bright you could not look at it. It was literally like having a star, and there was no shadows in the house. It was so bright,
What?
it blew the shadows right out. I mean, it was wild as hell. This thing was so
Whoa.
powerful, and he said you can buy one for like $7,000. And he was telling me some of the applications they use them for in technology and science. But if I can find that guy's business card, I got to get you in touch with this guy, because he knew a lot about light like you do, but he's a scientist. I think he was a physicist, but he developed this technology, and I think it would blow your mind. I mean, this was a powerful experience. It was literally like having the sun right in your house. Hi, guys. What do you reach for when you want a little pickup, when you want a little happy making? There's lots of things that I used to love. For example, I used to love my espresso in the afternoon, but that caused me lots of problems, so I had to retool that one. There's a lot of things that have sugar in them, but my body hates that. If you want to be healthy and you want to be clean, there's not much you can do. But Organifi's got some new happy drops that, believe me, are really good. And they're simple. They've got passion flower, go-to cola, organic saffron, and ginger root extract. And these things are awesome. You put a couple in your mouth. I like to suck them and let them melt down slow. And in a few seconds, you are feeling happy again with a little mood elevation and a little energy lift too. I absolutely love these things. My kids love them. And the thing I love about them is they make me feel good without doing anything but good for me. So if you want to get some happy drops, go ahead and try these. You're going to be amazed. I absolutely love these things, and my kids love them too. And I know you're going to love them. And you don't have to feel guilty about it, because there's nothing in there that's bad for you at all. Far better than an addictive anything, and great for you. Try Organifi's Happy Drops.
To try Organifi's new Happy Drops and to get 20% off your order, go to Organifi.com/Chek20 and use the promo code Chek20 at checkout. That's Organifi.com/Chek20. Organifi.com/CHEK20. And the promo code is CHEK20 for a 20% discount.
That's incredible. Yeah, I would love to be connected with him if you find his
Yeah.
information. I mean, I'm thinking, I know in China they're working on nuclear fusion, and they basically have a mini sun that they've generated over there. I don't know if he's also doing fusion at like a small scale, but freaking awesome. Very, very cool. I think there's an immense potential here. It's like super low hanging fruit. And it's also something that I think we've just really missed the mark on societally is thinking that light is superfluous and like doesn't matter and like all we need to focus is on like reducing our energy
Yeah.
costs and we're not thinking about light as nutrition and we're paying a toll as a result of that. And so I think there's just a ton of low hanging fruit here. Like we just need good quality science to just to show as evidence. I don't think we really need that much more evidence, but there's policymakers that I think are coming into play, like Bobby, for example, who would actually be open to. I mean, they're already beginning to reverse the incandescent light bulb ban at the very least, but I'm hopeful that we can make more strides to, improve the lighting of public spaces and reducing light at night and all these things. That's why I'm just like beating this drum to death. But I think Vogel's work, that he was doing that in like the 80s, I believe, and it's just I don't want it to be lost to time. I think there's an immense potential that we can learn here, and we could potentially use other crystals too. Like, who knows? We may be able to study different types of crystals and diamonds, for
Mm-hmm.
example, and see how these different gems can work to create different frequencies of light
Mm-hmm.
and tune that to the needs of an individual's body. I think it's just an incredibly uh, interesting area of science and medicine to kind of unfold. And so I'm very curious to see where it goes and hopeful to contribute to it as well because I think I mean with some of the so I've been working with Nicole Shanahan who was Bobby's running mate,
Mm-hmm. Amazing
and
woman.
she's amazing. She's highly motivated as well. Her daughter has autism from a vaccine injury, and so she's super motivated to develop technology and do good science that could help to support her daughter's state and also other children who are afflicted throughout the world. And so we're working together to hopefully get the lab funded pretty soon. So hopefully we can get some studies going sooner than later. But I mean, outside of that, with regards to some esoteric aspects of sun, I mean, the last thing that I guess I would want to mention is like the tarot, which I know that you're really interested in as well. If you want to talk about that.
Well, I love tarot. I'll let you share because if I start talking, we'll probably make the podcast so long most people will not have the aptitude or the attention to handle it. I teach tarot workshops and I've been a tarot practitioner for many, many years and I study it to this very day. And I have many tarot lessons in Spirit Gym and I'm teaching all the Spirit Gym practitioners a lesson on each of the major archetypes. Um, so they understand how these things work in the human psyche. But I was tickled to death when I saw your outline and you had tarot and zodiac and information. I'm like, wow, finally someone that's not just a left brain scientist, but actually has room in her life for the secrets of the divine.
Amen to that. Yeah, so I got really into astrology like 4 years ago, and then last year, earlier in the year, I took 250 hours of astroherbalism training, which I'll actually touch on here because that's where I found out about the tarot and the relationship to astrology. Because prior to that, I had understood it as a system of archetypes, but I didn't understand the link to different astrological archetypes within
And
that. So
alchemy, it's linked right into alchemy.
and alchemy. Absolutely. I mean, if we talk about astrology, it's really rooted in the study of alchemy and the
Hmm.
elements. And that's, a lot of people understand astrology through the lens of like pop astrology, and it's just completely different than the actual, what it was intended for as like a tool for divination and self-inquiry and empathy as
Hmm.
well. But within astrology, the sun rules the cardiovascular system as a whole, as well as the thymus gland and the eyes. And it's actually an interesting link here. And when I started learning this, I was just connecting so many dots because I learned about, UVA light and nitric oxide. And then we're learning about the cardiovascular system. Nitric oxide is like the most important factor for cardiovascular health because it allows the blood vessels to maintain their pliability, their ability to be flexible and dynamic and to deliver nutrients and wastes and allow the body to function well and also to circulate chi and light as well. And so the cardiovascular system is doing all of these things, and the sun as a ruler of this system, it makes sense. It's delivering warmth and light and energy and vitality to your body, as is the cardiovascular system too. So there's also a link. So two links actually: the heart chakra and the solar plexus. So the heart chakra is um, is also ruled by the sun, as the cardiovascular system is. But the solar plexus, as the name implies, is also basically sun network, is what the name translates to. And in Ayurveda and more ancient practices, they thought about the solar plexus as this alchemical furnace and the seat of the Agni. which is like this primordial fire that's allowing you to process things that are coming in and turn it into yourself.
There's something about the
Um,
solar plexus I want to share with you when you're ready.
cool, go
I
ahead.
learned this from Ibrahim Karim, and it really shocked me because
Love
it was
him.
so obvious. It's one of those things that's so obvious you don't see it. But he said, Paul, you realize the third chakra is outside your body in all the plants and trees that photosynthesize. Our third chakra is the kingdom of nature, and it's doing the photosynthesis. The solar plexus largely controls the digestive system, which break down the products of photosynthesis. So he said, one of the reasons to worship and protect nature is because it is your third chakra. It's where you develop your sense of self. Without a body, you cannot have a sense of self until you're a much more evolved soul, which is the science of alchemy, is how to extract your spirit out of the need for a physical body. That's what alchemy is.
Wow, that's so interesting and it makes perfect sense. And we also that links back to what we talked about earlier with the relationship between the soils and the gut
Yep.
microbes. Like it's one and the same. Like the soils are part of our body, and we can't have health in one without health in the other. And it just makes perfect sense to think about that as like outside of you, the trees and the plants and the animals are all organs for yourself as well. It's just we our egos separate ourselves from the whole, but it's all
That's the
connected.
problem with indoctrination. You
Yeah. That's why my podcast is called
Oh,
Undoctrinate
really?
Yourself.
My buddy
Yeah.
Cal Callahan's podcast is titled Unlearn, and he's got great shirts that say
I love
Unlearn. I
that.
love Unlearn. It's gorgeous. So Undoctrinate is
Thank
also
you.
Unlearn, right? It's beautiful. I didn't
Exactly.
know that. Congratulations on such a great name.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it was, fitting given that I went through so many years of indoctrination, though managed to, like, stay out of it and kind of just see it for what it was, take what was useful and leave the
Yeah, well, the
rest.
military is the same
Um
way.
Exactly, yeah, but I mean, going back to the solar plexus, the seat of the personal power and the will, we even have phrases around this, like, "Do you have the gall for it? Do you have the stomach for it?" Or
Mm-hmm.
phrases related to, like, our
Mm-hmm.
willpower, and we literally get charged up, our will, our personal power gets charged up by the sun, both literally and figuratively, we can think about that as well. The thymus is a primary organ where the immune system gets trained, to understand the difference between self and other and what's, like, a healthy boundary of self
Mm-hmm.
and other. Our ultimately our differentiation into individuals. We can kind of think about it that way. And so a lack of solar energy also means that if we don't know the truth of ourselves or our uniqueness, and we won't allow ourselves to express those truths out into the world. And so having a healthy expression of solar energy internally, but also, naturally taking in that solar energy can help us to find our place and our path and our mission. I mean, that's definitely been my experience. Ever since I fell down the rabbit hole on light and quantum biology, it's like I've just magnetized the absolute best people into my life. Everything has changed overnight for me. Like I just feel like uh really in my power and my purpose. It was like the thing I was
Well,
looking
also the
for.
third chakra is the home of personal power and self-will, as you just
Uh-huh.
stated correctly. But when we're really in alignment with our soul, we naturally shine our light. Sometimes parents say to their kids as when they're leaving home, go out in the world and shine your light. So when we see someone that's ensouled, like a singer or a musician, like, you can feel Ray Charles and Stevie Wonder shining their light, even though they're blind. Their light just shines through their voice and their music, and we feel it, right? And so I
Absolutely.
think this is the spiritual light, not the physical light, and so that's when we're really um, listening to our inner guidance system at home in ourselves and comfortable being who we really are, and not worrying about what other people think. And that's when,
Yes.
Jung calls that individuation, to step into your unique individuality and to live it, breathe it, and be it, regardless of what the consequences are, because then you die whole as somebody who's not confused about who they are and where they came from and where they're going.
Absolutely, and I can definitely relate to what you said, and I've been working with I've worked with a few hundred clients over the past few years, and since going into this work and helping people to align their lives more with the sun and not fearing the sun and getting out, at different times of day, morning, midday, evening, and really aligning their circadian rhythms. I personally have found, and I've had so many people come back to me and say, like, I used to be such a people pleaser. I never, felt healthy setting boundaries with people and just would always bend over backwards for others and at the sacrifice of myself. And ever since, engaging in these practices, I just feel like I want to express my healthy
Yeah.
boundaries and not to do the things that aren't in alignment. And I noticed personally for myself, there were kind of 2 points in my life where I felt my intuition really come online, like the volume knob got turned up. One was when I came off of birth control, hormonal birth control in
Good
2017,
idea.
and the other was when I started engaging in these practices where it was just like the volume knob got maxed out, and it's now like I can't even it's not even fathomable for me to go against my intuitive knowing on anything. It's like if it's right for me, I'm doing it, and if it's not, I don't have any time for
Amen.
it. Yeah. And so that's something I've heard from a lot of people as well, like engaging with the physical light helps the spiritual light
It
shine
does.
forth. So there's like this direct link between
Hmm.
them. With regards to astrology, Leo is ruled by the sun, and the fifth house is also ruled by the sun because it's ruled by Leo. Leo is all about self-expression, creativity, connection to pleasure and joy. Gold, with regards to the alchemist, gold was seen as basically the physical distillation of solar energy on
Yeah.
Earth. And that was like the whole idea of the alchemist was this transmutation of lead into gold. And so I think that's also relating to basically taking something that's impure and readily available at like a basic level and into something that's scarce and valuable and that embodies the essence of the spark of life itself. And the philosopher's stone is role
Well,
in that. So I think it's
spiritually, lead to gold means ego dominance to soul
yes,
dominance. And and that
100%.
philosopher's stone is the accumulation of wisdom from your life experience. All you can take when you
Mm,
die is what you've become, and that's your stone.
mm-hmm. Makes perfect sense. And I think anybody who has spent time living in their ego or their, shallow self feels that density and that
Hmm.
heaviness relative to the levity that you experience when you're on your path and your
Hmm.
power. It's just a complete night and day
Yeah.
difference. And things just come so much more effortlessly and easily when you're on the right path. It's like the universe is rewarding you for leaning into
Well,
that
your love
energy.
becomes magnetic. So you, instead of trying to find people, places, and things, you draw them to you because that's the power of love. It's magnetic.
100%. And then with regards to the Kabbalistic traditions, Tefereth, which is the central Sephira within the Kabbalistic tree, was associated with the sun, and it relates to beauty and balance and spirituality, basically bringing balance between opposing forces, yin and yang. Sunday is also ruled by the sun, as the name implies, and that's supposed to be a day where we kind of do what nourishes us and fuels us, creative passion projects, things like that. I think oftentimes Sundays are treated today as just like a lazy day to loaf around and just, regret working the job that you're working and dread going into work the next
Hmm.
day. And
Well,
it's so not meant to do
more
that.
people die of heart attacks on Monday than any other day of the week, just because the thought of
Yes,
having to go back to that
exactly.
mundane job is enough to kill them.
Yes, exactly. And I think there's just far too many people. It's just such a waste of potential for anybody to not do work that lights them up. And of course, you can be in your prostitute archetype for a period of time in order to get to the goal
Sure.
that your ultimate dream or goal. But to stay there and just numb yourself out to the fact that you're squandering your potential is just, it's not only a waste for you, but for humanity because we're each meant to be here to contribute something unique and special to the whole. And so many people aren't doing that. And it's eating people away. I think honestly, it's a major cause of chronic
Oh,
disease, in
that's
my
a sign of
opinion.
indoctrination as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, just going with, like, keeping up with the Joneses and
It
doing what
means
everybody
you
else is
become
doing
a
despite what people are
robot.
telling you. Yep, exactly. And then with regards to the tarot, so we mentioned this, there's 7 cards in the deck, 1 in the major arcana, so the Sun card is the 19th card. I pulled the cards,
Hmm.
so I'll just, like, show them as I go. And then we have 6 cards that are in the minor arcana, and they're all the sun cards. There's basically virtue, which is the 3 of wands, which is the sun in
Hmm.
Aries. And I love this deck too. This was oh gosh, whose deck was this? I don't know if I have it's one of the classic decks. I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but when I
Aleister
first got this
Crowley. Yeah, it
yes,
looks
that's
like it.
it. When I first got this deck, there were multiple people that reached out to me and they were like, "Be careful working with that. It's like dark
Yeah, that's
magic or
just
something."
it. You know, Christians
Yeah,
all think tarots are the devil anyhow, but that's the sign of
I
how
know.
indoctrinated they are. By the way, tarot 18,
Exactly.
if you look at the Rider Waite deck, which is the one I prefer and I teach with, 18 has the eclipse of the sun and the moon as well. So 18 is all
Oh,
about looking into your shadow and healing and getting rid of your baggage.
noted. I'll have to pull
Mhm.
that one. That's 18 in the major arcana?
18, tarot 18 is the moon. It's called the
Okay,
moon card.
got it.
Yeah.
Ah, got it. Okay, got it. Yeah, so we have virtue, which is sun in Aries. We have ruin, which is sun in Gemini. We have prudence, which is the sun in Virgo, pleasure, the sun in Scorpio, strength, the sun in Sagittarius, and power, the sun in Capricorn. When I was first learning tarot, I was again learning it through the lens of astroherbalism. So I would love to take your tarot workshop because I feel like I don't know if you focus on the astrology
No,
portion, but I would love to
no,
learn
I,
from that
I,
different
I
lens.
teach a completely different form of tarot that my soul taught me. And I show
Cool.
you how to use the archetypes of the tarot as a means of developing a language with your soul, because many people haven't got the spiritual development to have a direct talk with their soul, a conversation. So, first, I teach how to communicate with the soul through energetic impulse, like a rising and lower of energy. But I show how you can ask your soul questions and how to read its responses through tarot so that the tarot archetypes become just like the alphabet in our language. So, I teach you
Awesome.
ways of interpreting what your soul is telling you through the tarot. And that is a step towards the continuing the practices to develop and grow yourself so that you actually have the ability to no longer need tarot or any other form of
Mhm.
input. Like I can sit here and talk to my soul while I'm talking to you and say, well, what should I ask her next? Or for example, when I looked at your energy field, I said, should I share what I see in Alexis's energy field with her? And my soul said yes. And it just turned on my clairvoyance and I told you. And
Mhm.
you already know what that led to, a confirmation to what's actually on your phone, which is a picture of your aura.
Crazy. It's crazy accurate. Yeah, it's amazing. So yeah, it sounds great the way you teach tarot as like a tool to for self-inquiry and connection with soul. I think that's kind of everything. Like we're really just here to develop tools that allow us to gain access to our own intuitive knowing. And I think was it Steiner who had a quote about like humans will constantly develop tools outside of themselves until they realize that the tools that they are developing outside of themselves are already available
He
inside of them.
said, humanity will continue to develop technology outside of themselves until they either destroy
Yeah.
the world or realize everything they've created outside of them is an inferior copy of what's inside of them. The question is, which will come first? And we're right
Boom.
there right now.
100%. Yes. And that's why it's also weird with like the transhumanism and like this very rapid accelerating push towards like
Mhm.
AI and like we're developing technology, but it's like to what end? Like nobody can tell you that. We're just like racing to what? Like what is the outcome of
Well, I
this?
always warn people you should be very concerned about the word artificial in front of intelligence. That should stop you and make you think deeply. I recently did a podcast with Federico Fagin. Do you know who that is? Oh, he's one of the
Mm-mm.
pioneers of silicone chips, and he's one of the top computer experts in the world. And he shares some very serious concerns about AI. And I won't share it now, but when the podcast comes out, if you want to hear from one of the top computer experts in the world, what his thoughts are and concerns are about AI, it's Federico Fagin. He's written two excellent books. One is called Silicone, I believe. But well, his concerns are very real, and he's like, I don't want to spoil the podcast, but it'll sober you up.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's definitely concerning, though. I mean, I'm hopeful that there are some voices on the rational side of things, but it's seems like everything is just very much teetering on an edge, like we kind of mentioned throughout the podcast, and it's just up to each of us to do the best we can with the information we have, and constantly trying to educate ourselves and undoctrinate ourselves so that we can see clearly and do better for ourselves, our families, our communities. Maybe one last thing that I'll mention. In regards to like the more esoteric or like the astroherbalism aspects of sunlight. It's just like what an imbalance of solar energy could look like, and also how you can treat that, let's say. So signs that solar energy can be deficient within the body would be low energy, feeling like you have your batteries on empty, essentially. Low vital force, poor digestion, feeling cold at rest, heart and cardiovascular issues, blood sugar regulation issues. Side note, Glenn Jeffries, who's a researcher in the light space, published a study about a year ago showing that 15 minutes of deep red light exposure, this was from a 670 nanometer light device, so 15 minutes of exposure, and then they did an oral glucose tolerance test 45 minutes later, and the total glucose response to the oral glucose tolerance test was 30% lower in the individuals that received the red light exposure for 15 minutes, in the hour prior to that. And so simply getting enough infrared light in your environment, a red light in your environment, is a incredible way to regulate your blood sugar levels, which, then improves your mood and your cognition and your energy stability. And we're meant to receive this red and infrared light all day long if we were spending time
Mhm.
outside. And I typically recommend people just take their meals outside when they can, because then you're going to be naturally stimulating your
Mhm.
mitochondria to clear that excess blood sugar. And now it's not sitting there stagnating in your bloodstream. And stagnation is another sign of poor solar energy within a
Mhm.
system. Also, psychological and emotional dysregulation, low metabolism, low libido, and diabetes in general as well. And so, on the higher end of things, if there's an imbalance of solar energy on the high end, we can see things like inflammation, anxiety, nervousness, high blood pressure, rapid metabolism. But interestingly, in herbalism, but also in, let's say, in regards to our light biology conversation, even if you're on the high end of imbalance with sun, if you get sun exposure, it helps to balance it out, kind of like an adaptogen would. It's like it either, kind of brings you back into
Mhm.
balance versus pushing you too much into one direction. So, for example, high blood pressure could be a sign of an excess of solar energy, an excess of heat and inflammation. But actually, if you get sun exposure, it lowers inflammation and it lowers blood pressure. And so there can be a balancing act on both sides by optimizing your sun exposure habits. You can both resolve low solar energy expression and also high solar energy expression. And signs of a healthy balance of solar energy would include things like a sense that your heart is your primary organ of perception. Like you have a very strong heart sense and feeling connected with your intuition, not feeling too hot or too cold at rest, having a good balance of activity and inactivity, healthy digestion and elimination, feeling enthusiastic, able to be authentic, and just feeling like you can be your true self in the world. And so, anyway, I thought those would just be nice little hallmarks that people can look for. And with regards to the herb side of things, some common solar herbs would include things like
Mhm.
ginger, calendula, sunflower, rosemary. Rosemary is one of my favorite solar herbs. So, as somebody who runs more on the damp, stagnant side of things with regards to constitution, anything that is warming and stimulating is really beneficial for me. And I know that I need that stimulation, whether it's from the sun or a combination of sun exposure with herbs. If my fingers and toes feel
Mm.
cold at
Mhm.
rest, then I leverage things like turmeric and ginger and
Mhm.
rosemary, and those circulatory stimulants help to bring blood flow to the
Mhm.
extremities. Rosemary is really good at bringing blood flow to the brain
Mhm.
specifically. Rosemary is ruled by both Mercury and the sun. So Mercury rules the communication, the intellect, cognition, and the brain. And so that's the Mercury rulership. The solar rulership has to do with bringing warmth, vitality, chi. And so rosemary is really good if you're somebody who has a sluggish mind, who, you struggle with thinking, but it's not quite a nootropic or a stimulant. It's not as intense as that. It's more so just bringing like warmth and vital force into the brain so that you can engage it, in whatever you're doing, whether you're studying or learning, etc., or doing a podcast. And so I love to use rosemary for before a podcast or before studying and learning things. It really just helps to get you into a flow state more easily, at least in my case. And it's been classically used in
It
those
vaporizes
applications as
nicely
well.
too.
Totally. It's delicious. You can grow it pretty well anywhere as well. We had a huge rosemary shrub in our front garden that I just planted from a little plant that I'd gotten at the store, and it really took off. Just make sure it's a more of a full sun place. It really likes a ton of sun as a sun ruled plant. And then you can, make different preparations. And when we're talking about working at like not only the physical level, but working at like the astral body as well, then you would want to think about using a spagyric
Mhm.
preparation, which is an alchemically produced herbal preparation that incorporates essentially what they're doing is separating the soul, the spirit, and the body of the plant, and then distilling it out to its essence, and then adding them all back in
Mm.
together. And so like a rosemary spagyric would be really good for somebody who wants that physical innervation and energization of their brain and their cognitive processes, but maybe if they're also struggling at a more like a higher level issue with, feeling like they're maybe imposter syndrome, or they don't feel like they, maybe like they don't fit in, or they're not able to embody their true purpose, then you can use something like a spagyric, and it can help to align you at all those different levels. And I love working with those. There's one brand called Natura Sophia that's really, really
Mm.
good. My teacher actually from Astroherbalism course through the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, he, in addition to teaching all these wonderful courses, also makes his own spagyric
That's good to know.
preparations. And
When the show notes are done, I'll look into that. I use Dr. Andrew Kaufman's Spiragic cilantro for helping detox heavy metals and all the crap from vaccine shedding out of my body, and it's really great stuff.
he makes really good,
The
Shilajit
best.
drops as well.
I've
Yeah, I
never
love
found
that
any
product.
even close to them. They're my all-time favorite.
I
I put them
agree.
in my tea every day. In fact, it's right here, right now.
Love it. Yeah, those drops are amazing. We also love them. Yeah, the spagyrics are really, really cool also because they're made with the astrological placements in
Mm-hmm.
mind. So, for example, let's talk about rosemary. So, rosemary is ruled by the sun or Mercury. So, depending on which planet you want to emphasize in the preparation, let's say you really want to focus on the mental and cognitive stimulated properties of Mercury and of rosemary, then you would maybe want to harvest that rosemary on the Mercury day, which is
Mm.
Wednesday, at the Mercury hour, which you can look online. There's like the hours differ based on each day, so I can't tell you exactly when it would be, but there's usually 1 to 2 Mercury hours per day. And so if you harvest that plant at the Mercury hour on the Mercury day, you're enhancing the mercurial energy within the final product. And then you can also prepare it during the Mercury hour if you want to concentrate that energetic into the final product as well. So it really makes so I did some like growing of herbs and preparations, and it really makes the process so much more magical and
Mm-hmm.
creative and fun when you're aligning all of these different forces to create this final product that you have the intention for it to, support your healing and your expression of yourself in the world. And it just really adds some like oomph to the final product when you go to use it. So I would highly recommend, if people haven't explored, to explore working with herbs, even if they're just kitchen herbs. Kitchen herbs are really nourishing. They're supportive from a detoxification perspective, from a gut health perspective, also from like a brain health perspective and different organs, like we were talking about rosemary. So there's lots of really fun ways to work with herbs in like creative ways that are kind of pulling from the esoteric in order to enhance their qualities. And so I think it's a really good outlet for people if they're
I got a
interested.
fantastic podcast I just recorded, I think yesterday, with Tom Gerhardt and Casey Kinzer, their husband and wife. And she's a shaman, medium, psychic who's an expert at making herbal mixes for vaporizing. And they're the best I've ever had, hands down. It's called Overblown Herbs. So if you, by the time your
Noted.
podcast out, it should come out fairly close to this one. And
Okay.
if you ever want to meet her, she's the real deal. And she knows a lot about herbs. And she makes the best smoke mixes, hands down, I've ever had. And she
I
and
would
she
love
does
yeah, I would
everything
love
you're
to be
talking
connected.
about. She's very tapped into all this. And she's a trained shaman. So she uses shamanism to do all this.
Wow, that's amazing. I can't wait to hear that episode. Yeah, I'm still pretty much an infant in the space of herbalism, but I'm just super intrigued by it, always thirsty to learn more and to do some tinkering myself and just play around with it and see what my experience is. I think it's a really fun way to do like some empirical science in somebody's life, in my own life, and like do your own research, see what works for you, tweak it a little bit, see, how it changes, and be a scientist. We're all born to be scientists. If you're a curious person that has sensory organs, you can be a scientist. We're kind of meant to be. It's
Mm-hmm.
just we've been gate kept from it societally. Like we think that, a scientist has to wear a lab coat and, work in an ivory tower, but we're all meant to be scientists in our own lives.
Well, step one is just pay attention.
Yes.
Pay
Please.
attention to your body. How come every time I eat this, I get pimples? Well, now you're a scientist. Congratulations.
Yes.
That's
Yes,
why I like to say,
exactly.
don't ask your doctor what you should take. Ask what you should take away.
Yes. So much of what people struggle with is things they're actively doing and not things they're not
Right.
doing. So before you try to add a pill or potion to fix your problem, do a thorough survey of your life and see, what might be to blame, because ultimately it's usually something that we're unconsciously engaging in that's causing our issues.
Yes.
Amazing. That'll be me.
Yeah. What a great podcast. I just want to acknowledge, thank you. And God, you're so in your soul. It's just gorgeous. And you're such a great example for everybody, women especially. It's like, it's so nice to see a woman in her power and in her bliss. I feel so nourished by just having spent this time with you, and I'm sure the listeners have. I wouldn't doubt if this podcast gets more listenership to the end than almost any of them out there. You're going to be right up there with Robert Gilbert and Ibrahim Karim and Sherry Tenpenny, and
Oh.
I'm just so proud of you, and I really feel blessed to have made connection with you. So thank you so much. Is there any websites or anything that you want to offer that you're up to, or and I also
Yeah.
think, Casey, it's really time for you to write a good book that anyone can understand and
Oh, yeah.
put
That's
this
coming.
into readable language, because I think the world needs what you have to offer. And it should be also put out on an audiobook so people can listen to it, because not that many people read much anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am actually working with an agent now to finish up a book
Right.
proposal. So that should be going, should be in the works in the summer. So hopefully the book will be out sometime next
Mm-hmm.
year. So that's definitely in the works. Really, really excited about it. It's gonna be, anybody could read it. And that's kind of how I designed my ebook as well, as something that even a middle schooler could pick up and understand, and understand how they can improve their life in simple steps. So that's already available for people, and I made a discount code Chek, CHEK10, for my ebook or for my most recent course, which was called Bootcamp Reboot, which is basically integrating quantum biological and light biology principles into your everyday practices and understanding how to optimize your lifestyle based on these different principles, so people can get 10% off that if they use the code. Outside of that, I also have a book club. So you mentioned Nathan Riley. He's in my
Great.
book club. It's super
Yeah.
fun. I love his energy. He's bringing a great energy. We have like about 200 people. Right now we're reading Robert O. Becker's book, The Body
Yeah.
Electric. We're also doing like watch parties for different podcasts where we watch together as a group on Zoom, and I like chime in with my like thoughts and interjections throughout, and it's been really fun. The community is really
Nathan's our
wonderful.
family
That's
OBGYN.
I love it. Yeah, he said something about like knowing Angie very intimately.
Uh-huh. And he is the best medical doctor I've ever met in my life, and one of the smartest people I know. And
I
he
love
was
it.
here with me and Kyle and a couple of my other very close friends on my 60th birthday, where we did a very, very deep medicine ceremony.
Whoa.
Very deep.
Way to ring in
What's
60.
that?
Good way to ring in
Yeah.
60.
See the couch behind me? Nathan
Uh-huh.
laid on that for 16 hours straight and didn't move.
Oh my god!
He was riveted to the couch and amazed at the ceiling for 16 hours. The journey lasted 21 hours, but it was a deep one. I only invited people that are deep enough to die at a ceremony. Um,
Was it peyote?
no, I don't want to really say what it was, because I
Oh,
don't want
that's
people
fine, don't
knowing
worry.
about how to do these things, because
That's
it
fair,
causes too much trouble. It was for
that's
advanced people only, and it took
got
everybody
it.
to the edges of themselves. I can promise you that.
I feel like Nathan's energy is probably still on that couch
Yeah,
back
I've
there.
done a few great journeys with Nathan, but he is just a gift from God, that guy. To have a doctor that's that smart, that loving, and that holistically integrated is absolutely just a gift to humanity.
Yeah, I've been enjoying getting to know him, but yeah, so that group is really fun. If people want a more community aspect, that's a really good place. It's $15 a month. Telegram community, and we do weekly watch parties and calls, and so yeah, those are kind of the different ways people can work with me. Otherwise, I don't really do one-on-one, so I do brain rentals occasionally. So if somebody needs
Like
one-on-one
a
support,
consultant.
they can rent my brain. Yep, they can rent my brain for an hour, and
What's
we
your
can,
fee for a
they can
brain
sit on
rent
board.
for an hour?
It's
Okay,
400 an
that's
hour.
fair. Yeah.
Yep, $400 an hour, and usually I have different protocols and stuff that I've written up. So if any of them apply, I just send them over included within that. And we can also record the call. So if they want to watch it back, they can do that. Other than that, I'm super active on Instagram, also active a bit on X. But I post a ton of free content over on Instagram. There's a free light lesson available. A bunch of content on my wall that's going into all these different points in science and unpacking different papers and different topics as it relates to light water, magnetism, mitochondrial biology, etc. So those are kind of the places people can find me and learn more if they're
Beautiful.
interested.
I hope that you get a massive response from this podcast. I can't wait to do our next podcast. I can't wait to have you here in person to meet the
Me
whole
too.
Rainbow family and meet my kids and our animals and just enjoy the gym and the sauna and the cold plunge and the pool and the trails and the
Can't wait.
pond and if you can go stand up paddling or whatever you want. All of us worked our asses off. So this is our dream home. It took us 5 years to find it. And it was by the grace of God that we did. And so it's a very special place. And we run all of our institute trainings here. So the students get to come here and enjoy it. And people absolutely dig it
Magical.
here. And there's tons of crystals in the earth here. So it's like you're in a really powerful vortex energy here.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I can't wait to experience it. My friend Elise did HLC3 with you. I mentioned like earlier that and she sent me pictures of your pigs
Yeah.
and stuff, and they were
Yeah.
so cute.
Is your friend Elise
Okay.
from New York? Oh,
She
she's
is.
amazing. I love her.
I
Oh
love
my
her
God, you
too.
two
She's
have
so
such
sweet.
similar spirit. It's amazing now that I know who you're talking about. Oh yeah, she's
Yes,
great.
yes. I love her. She's wonderful. She's actually, it's a funny story. She was actually born the same day, same year as my partner of 11
Wow.
years. We met, and actually, when we first met, the first thing we bonded over was like, you know who Paul Chek is? You know who Paul Chek is?
Oh man, I'm in the middle of so many things.
You are. And then the second thing was like, oh, you're born on the same day as my partner, who's also obsessed with Paul Chek. Like, we're all just peas in a pod.
Oh my God, too funny. I was saying to Penny when you and I took a break, I said, man, I'm getting old. The number of people that tell me I inspired their journey into holistic health who are, grown up, mature adults it's so many. Like the number of people that have come on my podcast is that, well, actually I got my start because of your book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, or your teachings or whatever. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm getting old. But it's pretty funny, I'm grateful that I devoted myself and still do. So I'll say
We're all
thank
grateful
you,
for that.
Alexis, and thank you to the sponsors for your amazing products and your commitment to supporting biodynamic and organic and free range farmers. And thank you for anything you buy from the sponsors, because it is the top stuff that meets my values and my family's values. It'll take care of you. You're taking care of the companies that are working their best to give us top-notch products, and you're supporting the farmers that need love and support because they're taking care of our planet. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this amazing journey with Alexis. And I hope you guys all track her down and learn lots more from her and look for her books. And when she puts on workshops and things, to do that. And maybe someday she can put a workshop on here at the Rainbow and you can come get an experience of Alexis and the Rainbow and have some great food and my charged water. And so thank you guys all. It's all hands on deck, as you hear me say often. And the best way to change the world is to change yourself. And you learned a lot of ways to do that today. So lots of love to all of you. Alexis, again, I bow to you, my dear. Keep living from your heart. You're awesome. And today was a special day for me to get to spend 3 hours with you.
Amen. Thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to do it
Oh,
again.
lots of love.
Thank you for listening to Spirit Gym with Paul Chek and today's guest, Dr. Alexis Cowan. If you enjoyed today's episode, we will be holding a Q&A session with Alexis exclusively for Spirit Gym podcast members. We invite you to become a member so that you can participate in this Q&A by going to paulchek.com/podcast. For less than $8 a month, you can get access to more exclusive members-only opportunities from Paul's guests, live Q&A sessions with Paul and his guests, access to the podcast members forum within the Spirit Gym community, where you can interact with other passionate listeners, and the chance to purchase exclusive Spirit Gym merchandise. So subscribe today by going to paulchek.com/podcast. Alexis is offering Paul's listeners 10% off her ebook, The Lux Living Health Optimization Handbook. Go to bit.ly/Alexis ebook and use the promo code Chek10. That's bit.ly/Alexis ebook and the code is Chek10. You can also get 10% off her latest course, Boot Camp Reboot, which helps you to integrate quantum biology and light biology principles into your everyday practices. Go to bit.ly/Alexis course and use the promo code Chek10 again. That's bit.ly/Alexis course. Make sure you check out Alexis's podcast, Undoctrinate Yourself, on Spotify or YouTube, and follow her on Instagram and X at Dr. Alexis Yasmin. That's DrAlexisJazmyn. She also has the Incubator Book Club and Think Tank, which you can join at dralexisjasmin.thinkify.com. You can find all these links on the show notes page at paulchek.com/podcast, as well as details on the special offers from our premier sponsors, Bioptimizers, Paleo Valley, Wild Pastures, and Organifi, and also the links to Paul's social media, his YouTube channels, and his blog. And finally, if you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and a warm review on the podcast platform of your choice. This podcast is available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, and YouTube.